In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a dusty sketchbook hides a chilling secret. Miss Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, uncovers a forgotten drawing from 1943, a stranger's face marked with one word: traitor. Who was this man who charmed the village during wartime, only to vanish in shadows? What betrayal cost lives, and why did Miss Marple bury the truth for decades? As she unravels cryptic codes, hidden letters, and whispers of espionage, each clue pulls her deeper into a web of deceit tied to a moonlit mill and a village elder's guilt. Will she expose the traitor's legacy before the past claims her too? Miss Marple's secret sketch is a gripping tale of memory, betrayal, and a quiet woman's relentless pursuit of truth. Chapter 1. The hidden sketch attic of Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead was a labyrinth of forgotten treasures, where dust motes danced in slanted beams of late afternoon light. The air smelled of aged wood and lavender, a scent that clung to the worn floorboards and the stacks of crates she hadn't touched in years. Jane Marple, with her silver hair neatly pinned and her cardigan slightly frayed at the cuffs, climbed the narrow staircase with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. It was a crisp autumn day in 1965, and something, perhaps the chill in the air or a nagging whisper in her mind, had urged her to rummage through the relics of her past. She wasn't one for sentimentality, but the attic called to her like an old friend with a secret to share, kneeling beside a cedar chest. She brushed away cobwebs and lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of memories, a chipped teacup from her mother's set, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and, tucked beneath, a folded quilt, a leather-bound sketchbook she hadn't seen in decades. Her fingers, still nimble despite her years, traced the embossed initials on the cover: JM, etched in a youthful flourish. A smile tugged at her lips. She'd been quite the artist in her day, sketching villagers and landscapes with a keen eye for detail, though she'd set aside such fancies long ago. Opening the sketchbook, she found pages filled with pencil drawings: the church spire at dusk, Mrs. Clement's rose garden, the blacksmith's hands at work. But as she turned a page near the middle, her breath caught. There, rendered in meticulous strokes, was the face of a man she hadn't thought of in years. His sharp jawline, the slight curve of his smile, and the piercing eyes that seemed to follow her even now were unmistakable. The sketch was dated July 1943, and beneath it, in her own careful hand, was a single word: traitor. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She sat back on her heels, the attic's chill forgotten. The war had been a distant thunder in St. Mary Mead, but it had touched her life in ways she'd never shared. In 1943, she'd been more than a spinster knitting by the fire. She'd volunteered for the war effort, decoding messages for a covert operation run from a nearby manor. The man in the sketch's name eluded her, but his face was branded in her memory. Had come to the village that summer, charming and elusive, with a shadow behind his smile. She'd drawn him one evening, compelled by an instinct she couldn't explain, as if her pencil knew something her mind hadn't yet grasped. Closing the sketchbook, she carried it downstairs to her parlor, where the fire crackled and her teapot steamed. She settled into her armchair, the sketchbook open on her lap, and let her mind drift back to that wartime summer. The village had been alive with whispers, then rumors of spies, of coded signals sent from the hills, of betrayal lurking in familiar faces. She'd been younger, sharper, her eyes catching details others missed, a glance held too long. A letter slipped into a pocket, a stranger's boots caked with mud from a path no one used. The man in the sketch had been at the heart of it, she was sure, but the details were hazy, like a tune half remembered. She sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the drawing. Why had she written traitor? What had she seen or known that made her mark him so? The word was a spark, igniting questions she'd buried under years of quiet village life. She turned the page, hoping for more clues, but found only a sketch of the old mill, its wheel still against the stream. Yet something about the mill tugged at her memory, a late-night walk, a flicker of light where none should be, the man's silhouette against the moonlit water. Miss Marple set the sketchbook on the table and rose, her movements deliberate. She crossed to her writing desk, where a small brass key unlocked a drawer she rarely opened. Inside was a bundle of papers from the war year's notes she'd kept. Fragments of codes she'd deciphered, letters from colleagues who trusted her sharp mind. She rifled through them, her fingers pausing on a yellowed envelope with no address, only her initials. Inside was a single sheet, folded tightly, its edges brittle. Unfolding it, she read the hurried scrawl. J.M., if you find this, you were right. He's not what he seems. Check the mill. EHEH. The initials sent a shiver through her. Edward Harrow, the village elder who'd been her confidant during the war. A man of quiet wisdom and cryptic warnings. He died in 1950. His secrets buried with him, or so she'd thought. The note was a lifeline to a mystery she'd left unsolved, a puzzle that had haunted her even as she'd wear upon scarves and solved petty village squabbles. The mill, the sketch, the man, they were pieces of a betrayal she'd glimpsed but never fully grasped. She returned to the sketchbook, studying the man's face again. His eyes held a challenge, as if daring her to remember. She closed her eyes, letting the past flood in. It was July 1943, and St. Mary Mead was buzzing with wartime fervor. Soldiers passed through. Billeted in local homes, women wear upon socks for the front, and Miss Marple, unassuming but razor-sharp, sat in the manor's library decoding messages that could save lives. The man, tall, with a voice like warm brandy, had arrived unannounced, claiming to be an officer on leave. He charmed the village, dancing with young women at the hall, buying rounds at the pub. But Miss Marple had noticed his questions too pointed, too curious about the manor's operations. She'd sketched him that night, sitting by her window, her pencil capturing the unease she felt. She'd seen him slip away from the dance, his shadow merging with the trees, heading toward the mill. She'd followed, unnoticed, her soft shoes silent on the grass at the mill. She'd seen him meet someone, a figure cloaked in darkness, their whispers too low to catch. She'd written Traitor not from proof, but from instinct, a certainty that grew with every odd detail. His knowledge of radio frequencies, his habit of vanishing at dusk, the way he avoided her gaze, the memory sharpened, and Miss Marple opened her eyes. The sketch was more than a drawing. It was a key, a confession she'd made to herself in a moment of clarity. She stood, her resolve hardening. The past wasn't done with her yet. She would start at the mill, retrace her steps, and uncover what she'd missed. The man's name, his purpose, the betrayal he'd woven into St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes, they were waiting to be unraveled. She glanced at the clock. It was nearing dusk. The sky outside her window bruised with purple. The mill was a short walk, its ruins still standing by the stream. She pulled on her coat, tucked the sketchbook under her arm, and stepped into the evening air. The village was quiet, its cottages glowing with lamplight, but Miss Marple felt the weight of secrets stirring. The man in the sketch was a ghost, but his shadow lingered, and she would follow it to the truth. As she walked, the crunch of gravel under her shoes was a steady rhythm, matching her thoughts. The mill loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the fading light. She paused at the stream, the water's murmur a faint echo of that wartime night. The sketchbook felt heavy in her hands, its pages a map to a mystery she'd left dormant too long. She opened it again, the man's face staring back, and whispered to herself, "Who were you? And what did you do?" The chapter closed with Miss Marple standing by the mill, the sketchbook clutched tightly, her mind alight with questions. The past had called her back, and she would answer, one careful step at a time. Chapter 2. Whispers of Whodunit. Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, the late morning light filtering through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. The sketchbook lay open on her lap, its pages yellowed but intact, the ink of her youthful drawings still sharp. Her fingers, slightly trembling with age, traced the outline of the stranger's face, a portrait she'd sketched decades ago. In the summer of 1943, the man's features were striking. High cheekbones, a sly smile, eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She hadn't thought of him in years, not since the war, when St. Mary Mead buzzed with whispers of danger and distrust. Yet here he was, staring up at her from the page, stirring memories she'd buried deep. The war had come to their quiet village in subtle ways, not with bombs or sirens, but with coded messages, ration books, and strangers who lingered too long. At the pub, Miss Marple, younger then, her mind as sharp as her knitting needles, had volunteered for the war effort, decoding messages for the Home Guard. It was tedious work. Hunched over a desk in the vicariage's back room, deciphering scribbled notes. That could mean life or death, but it was also thrilling. A puzzle that demanded her keen observation. The man in the sketch had been one such puzzle, a charming visitor who arrived in St. Mary Mead, under the guise of a weary traveler, but whose presence left ripples of unease. She closed the sketchbook, her thumb brushing against the spine, and felt something shift inside. Curious, she opened the cover and found a folded letter, its edges brittle, tucked into a hidden flap. Her breath caught as she unfolded it, recognizing her own neat handwriting on the envelope. To be opened only by J.M., 1943. The letter was addressed to herself, a precaution from her younger self, as if she'd known this day would come. The words inside were brief but heavy. Jane, if you read this, the past has returned. The man you sketched is not who he claimed. His name is tied to betrayal, and the truth lies in what you saw that summer. Trust your memory. Trust the sketch. Her heart quickened. The letter was a whisper from her past, a call to unravel a mystery she'd left unsolved. She remembered the man's arrival, his polished boots, his easy laughter at the village fete, the way his eyes darted to the shadows. He'd called himself a writer, seeking solace in the countryside, but his stories never quite added up. And then there was the night he vanished, after a dance at the village hall, leaving behind rumors of espionage and a village forever changed. Miss Marple set the letter down and stood, her shawl slipping to the floor. She needed to remember more, to piece together the fragments of that summer. The sketch was no mere drawing. It was a clue, a thread in a tapestry of secrets. She glanced at the clock, 11:30. There was time before lunch to begin her quiet quest. She would start with the vicariage, where she'd worked during the war, where the whispers of 1943 might still linger. The lane to the vicariage was lined with hawthorn hedges, their blooms long faded, but their scent still faint in the July air. St. Mary Mead hadn't changed much since the war, same stone walls, same gossip at the post office, but to Miss Marple, every corner held a memory. She passed the butcher's shop, where Mr. Hodge still waved cheerfully, and the bakery, where the scent of fresh scones mingled with the tang of nostalgia. The vicariage stood at the end of the lane, its ivy-covered walls unchanged, though the garden was wilder now, untamed since Mrs. Clement's arthritis had worsened. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, greeted her at the door with a warm smile. Jane, what a delight. Come in, come in. I've just put the kettle on. Her voice was bright, but her eyes were tired, her hands knotted with age. She led Miss Marple to the sitting room, where a fire crackled despite the summer warmth. The room was a museum of the past faded photographs on the mantel. A chipped teapot from the war years, a wireless radio that hadn't worked in decades. They settled with their tea, the clink of cups filling the silence. Miss Marple wasted no time. "Dolly," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I've been thinking about the war, about 1943. Do you remember a visitor to the village, a man, charming, perhaps too charming, who stayed for a few weeks?" Mrs. Clement's brow furrowed, her spoon pausing mid-stir. 1943. Goodness, Jane, that's a lifetime ago. We had so many strangers then, soldiers, evacuees, odd sorts passing through. Was he one of those writers, always scribbling in a notebook? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. He was tall, dark-haired, with a smile that made you trust him. But there was something off. I sketched him once, you see, and I found the drawing today. It brought it all back. Double quotes. Mrs. Clement leaned back, her eyes distant. A sketch, you say? You were always sketching, Jane, even then. I remember you sitting in the vicarage, pencil in hand, watching everyone. There was a man. What was his name? He came to the fete, danced with all the girls, made old Mrs. Price blush. But he was gone by autumn, wasn't he? Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Gone, yes, but not forgotten. There were rumors, Dolly, about a traitor in the village, someone passing secrets to the enemy. Did you ever hear such talk? The room grew still. The fire's crackle suddenly loud. Mrs. Clement set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. Traitor. Oh, Jane, those were dark days. We didn't talk about much bad for morale, you know. But yes, there were whispers. The home guard was always on edge, checking barns, watching strangers. They said someone was signaling from the old mill, sending messages to who knows where. I never believed it was one of our own, though. St. Mary Mead folk are loyal. Loyal. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, but even loyal folk can be swayed. This man, I think he was involved, and I think someone in the village knew more than they let on. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. You don't mean someone we knew? Jane, you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything yet, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but her mind alight. I'm only remembering. Tell me, Dolly, do you recall anything specific about that summer? Anything odd? Anything? That didn't sit right. Mrs. Clement frowned, her fingers twisting a napkin. Well, there was that night at the village hall, the dance. Everyone was there, laughing, pretending the war wasn't happening. That man, your charming stranger, he was there, wasn't he? I remember him dancing with Clara Henshaw. Poor thing. She was smitten, followed him around like a puppy. But after that night, he was gone, and Clara, she wasn't the same. Miss Marple's heart skipped. Clara Henshaw. The name struck a chord, though she couldn't place why. Clara, she said softly. What happened to her? She left the village a year or so later, Mrs. Clement said, moved away. No word. Her mother said she'd gone to London, but no one heard from her again. Strange. Now that I think of it, she was such a lively girl, always singing. After that dance, though, she was quiet, jumpy even. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tea forgotten. And the man, did anyone see him leave? Mrs. Clement shook her head. Not that I recall. He just vanished, like a ghost. The home guard searched, of course, but they found nothing. Just rumors, Jane. Rumors and fear. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. Mrs. Clement's roses, the new curate's sermons, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. Clara, Henshaw, the dance. The whispers of a traitor. She thanked her friend, promising to return soon, and stepped back into the summer air, the sketchbook tucked under her arm. The letter's words echoed, "Trust the sketch, back at home." Miss Marple spread the sketchbook on her dining table, the letter beside it. She turned to the portrait again, studying the man's eyes. They were clever, calculating, not the eyes of a mere writer. She flipped through the pages, finding other sketches from that summer village scenes, the mill, the vicarage garden. But one page caught her eye, a rough sketch of the village hall, its windows aglow, figures dancing inside. In the margin, in her own tight script, was a note. E.L. slipped out, 10:15 p.m. Met someone by the oak. E.L. Edward Langley, she was certain. The initials matched the names she'd later uncover. But who had he met, and why had she written it down? She closed her eyes, willing her memory to sharpen. The dance had been a blur of music and laughter, but she remembered watching Langley, his charm a mask she couldn't quite trust. She'd followed him, hadn't she? Not physically, but with her eyes, noting his every move. And she'd seen him slip out, just as the band played a slow waltz. Disappearing into the night, she stood, pacing the room, her mind piecing together fragments. The oak tree was still there, behind the village hall, its branches gnarled and heavy. Had she followed him that night? Or had she only watched from a distance? The memory was hazy, but the sketchbook was clear. She'd been suspicious even then. Young and untested, but already honing the instincts that would define her. The letter, though, was the key. She read it again, her eyes lingering on the line. His name is tied to betrayal. Had she known, even in 1943, that Langley was a traitor, or had she only suspected? Her sketch and note a way to preserve what she couldn't yet prove. She needed more memories, more clues. The village archives might hold something. Perhaps a photograph or a record from the war years. And Clara Henshaw, her name, was a thread she couldn't ignore. Had she been a victim, a lover, or something more? The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the village library, a small stone building that doubled as the archive. Miss Hartnell, the librarian, was sorting through a box of old newspapers, her glasses perched on her nose. Miss Marple, what brings you here? Not another of your mysteries, I hope. Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were curious. Just a bit of nostalgia, Miss Marple said, smiling. I'm looking for records from the war, 1943 specifically. Anything about visitors to the village, or the Home Guard's activities. Miss Hartnell raised an eyebrow but led her to a dusty corner where boxes of wartime documents were stacked. Not much call for these, she said, pulling out a ledger. But we've got minutes from the Home Guard meetings, some old photographs, even a few letters. What are you after? A man, Miss Marple said vaguely. A visitor from that summer. I think his name was Langley. Miss Hartnell's hands paused. Langley rings a bell. There was a fellow, an officer, I think, charmed the socks off everyone. Let me see. She rifled through a folder, pulling out a photograph yellowed with age. It showed a group at the village fete, smiling. For the camera. In the center was the man from her sketch tall, dark-haired, his smile as disarming as she remembered. The caption read, St. Mary Mead Fete, July 1943. Capped Edward Langley with locals. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. That's him, she said, her voice steady despite the thrill. Do you have anything else? Perhaps about a woman named Clara? Henshaw? Miss Hartnell frowned. Clara. She was a sweet girl. Worked at the post office during the war. Left suddenly, didn't she? Let me check the parish records. She bustled off, returning with a thin file. Inside was a single-page marriage certificate dated August 1943, linking Clara Henshaw to Edward Langley. Miss Marple stared at the document, her mind racing. Married, Clara, and Langley, the implications were staggering. Had Clara known what Langley was? Had she been complicit, or merely caught in his web? The certificate listed Clara's address as a cottage on the hill, now long abandoned. Miss Marple thanked Miss Hartnell, tucking the photograph into her bag, and left the library with a new purpose. The cottage might hold answers, or at least more questions. The cottage was a mile outside the village, its stone walls crumbling, its windows boarded. Miss Marple stood before it, the wind tugging at her scarf. The place felt heavy, as if it held secrets of its own. She pushed open the gate, its hinges squealing, and stepped into the overgrown garden. The door was locked, but a loose board on a window gave her access. Inside, the air was musty, the furniture draped in dust sheets. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for anything that might connect to Langley or Clara. In a drawer, she found a bundle of letters, their ink faded, but legible. They were from Clara to her mother, written in the months after the marriage. The words were laced with fear. Mother, I don't know who he is anymore. Edward's friends come at night, speaking in whispers. I hear things I shouldn't, plans, codes, places I've never heard of. I'm afraid to ask, afraid to know. Miss Marple's hands trembled as she read. Clara had been no bystander. She'd been pulled into Langley's world, knowingly or not. Another letter mentioned a box under the floor, hidden for safety. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting, and pried at the floorboards in the corner. One gave way, revealing a small tin box. Inside was a photograph of Langley, smiling, standing beside a man whose face was half-shadowed. She didn't recognize him, but the setting was familiar. The old mill. Its wheels still in the background. She sat back, the photograph in her lap. The mill. The coded note in her sketchbook had pointed there, to coordinates she hadn't yet deciphered. Langley had been signaling from the mill. She was sure of it. But who was the man in the photograph? And what had Clara known that made her flee? That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the sketchbook open once more. She turned to the coded note, its numbers and letters a puzzle she hadn't cracked in 1943. Now, with decades of experience, she saw it differently. The code was simple, a substitution cipher she'd used during the war. She worked quickly, her pencil scratching across a notepad. The numbers became coordinates, the letters a time. Midnight, July 17, 1943, near the mill. Her breath caught. That was the night of the dance, the night Langley had slipped out. She'd seen him go, hadn't she? And she'd sketched the hall, noted his departure, as if her younger self had known it mattered. The mill was the key, the place where Langley's betrayal had taken shape. She needed to visit it, to see what remained. But first, she needed help, someone younger, someone who could climb through brambles and dig through history. She thought of Tommy, the historian who'd come to St. Mary Mead researching wartime espionage. He'd mentioned files, records of double agents. Perhaps he could shed light on Langley, or the shadowed man in the photograph. She wrote a note, inviting him to tea tomorrow, and slipped it into the postbox. As she returned to her parlor, the sketchbook seemed to glow in the firelight, its secrets whispering louder now. The chapter closed with Miss Marple staring at the portrait, the letters' words echoing. Trust the sketch, she would, she decided. She would follow its clues, unravel the betrayal, and find the truth that had lain hidden for so long. Chapter 3. The village's forgotten guest. Morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a soft, gray shawl curling around the hedgerows and softening the edges of the stone cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. The sketchbook lay open on the table before her, its worn pages revealing the haunting portrait of a man whose face stirred memories she had long buried. The cryptic sketch, with its sharp lines and shadowed eyes, was no mere doodle from her youth. It was a key to a secret that had festered in the village for decades. Yesterday's discovery of the letter tucked inside the sketchbook's cover had shaken her. Its faded ink hinted at a name, a purpose, and a betrayal. Today, she would take the first step toward unraveling it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm against her fingers, and considered her next move. The letter, written in a hurried hand, mentioned a visitor who had charmed the village during the war, a man whose easy smile hid something darker. She needed someone who remembered those days as clearly as she did, someone whose tongue might loosen over a cup of tea and a scone. There was only one person in St. Mary Mead who fit that description, Mrs. Dorothy Clement, the vicar's wife, whose memory for village gossip was as sharp as her needlepoint. Tucking the sketchbook under her arm, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her steps purposeful as she made her way down the lane to the vicarage. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the village was waking slowly. Mrs. Price's bakery was just opening, the scent of fresh bread wafting out, and young Billy Tucker was pedaling his bicycle, delivering the Morning Post. Miss Marple nodded to him, her mind already turning over the questions she would ask Dorothy. The vicarage loomed ahead, its ivy-covered walls a neat garden, a picture of pastoral calm, though Miss Marple knew that even such tranquil places held secrets. Dorothy Clement greeted her at the door with a warm smile, her round face framed by a halo of gray curls. "Jane, what a delight. Come in, come in. I've just put the kettle on, and there's a batch of scones fresh from the oven." Her voice was bright, but her eyes flicked to the sketchbook under Miss Marple's arm, a spark of curiosity igniting. "Thank you, Dorothy," Miss Marple said, stepping into the cozy parlor. The room was a comforting clutter of chintz cushions, dog-eared hymnals, and framed photographs of the Clement family through the years. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a glow over the tea tray. Dorothy was already preparing. "I've come on a bit of an odd errand, I'm afraid. Something from the past has been nagging at me." Dorothy's eyebrows rose as she poured the tea. "The past, oh, Jane, you know I love a good story. Is it about one of your old cases? You were always so clever during the war, with all that code-breaking business." She handed Miss Marple a cup, her eyes gleaming. "Do tell." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into an armchair. "It's not quite a case, not yet, but I've found something, an old sketchbook of mine from 1943. There's a drawing, in it a portrait, and it's brought back memories of a certain visitor to St. Mary Mead, a man who came and went rather quickly, but left quite an impression." Dorothy's hands paused over the scone plate. "A visitor, in 43. My goodness, that was a busy time. The village was crawling with soldiers, volunteers, and all sorts of strangers passing through." "Can you describe him?" Miss Marple opened the sketchbook, turning to the page with the portrait. The man's face stared up at them, sharp cheekbones, a charming smile, eyes that seemed to hold a secret. "This is him," she said, sliding the book toward Dorothy. "I sketched him one summer evening at the vicarage garden party. I think he was charming, well-spoken, but there was something off about him. Do you remember anyone like that?" Dorothy leaned forward, squinting at the sketch, her lips pursed, and for a moment she was silent, her fingers tapping the edge of her teacup. Then her eyes widened. "Oh, Jane, I do remember him. Not his name. Mind you, it's been too long, but that face. He was at the garden party, wasn't he? So dashing. All the girls were half in love with him. He had a way of talking, like he'd seen the world. But he didn't stay long. Did he? Gone by the end of summer, if I recall. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the sketchbook. Yes, that sounds like him. I've been trying to piece together who he was and why he was here. The letter I found mentioned a visitor who wasn't what he seemed. I wonder if you heard any talk back then, rumors, perhaps, about someone in the village who might have been less than loyal. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth, her scone forgotten. Loyal? You mean a traitor? Oh, Jane, that's a serious thing to say. But she hesitated, glancing toward the window as if the misty village beyond might overhear. There were whispers. You know, during the war, everyone was on edge. People saw spies in every shadow. There was talk of someone passing secrets, messages, maps, that sort of thing. I never paid it much mind. But the older women, like Mrs. Price's mother, they were convinced someone in St. Mary Mead was helping the enemy. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Helping the enemy? Did they say who? Dorothy shook her head, spreading clotted cream on a scone with a thoughtful frown. No names. Not that I heard. Just gossip, old Mrs. Price muttering about late-night comings and goings, lights in the woods near the mill. And there was that business with the dance, wasn't there? The one at the village hall, right after the garden party. That manure man in the sketch, he was there, charming everyone. But I remember Mrs. Price saying she saw him slip out early, looking furtive. She thought he was meeting someone. Miss Marple's knitting needles, resting in her lap, seemed to still as her mind raced. The dance. She hadn't thought of it in years. But now the memory flickered to life. The village hall decked with bunting, the gramophone playing a lively tune, and that man tall, handsome, his smile a little too perfect, moving through the crowd like a fox among hens. She had watched him, her younger self alert to the smallest details, noting how he excused himself during a waltz, his coat flapping as he disappeared into the night. Dorothy, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. Do you recall anything else about that night? Anyone he spoke to, perhaps, or anything unusual? Dorothy took a sip of tea, her brow furrowing. Let me think. It was so long ago. There was a woman not from the village, I don't think. She came with one of the officers, but she kept to herself, mostly. Dark hair, very quiet. I remember because she wore a red scarf, quite striking. I saw her talking to your man once or twice, near the refreshment table. They looked secretive. You know, heads close together, whispering. I thought they might be sweethearts. But there was something odd about it. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A woman with a red scarf. The letter in the sketchbook hadn't mentioned a woman, but the detail felt significant, like a thread she could tug to unravel the mystery. Did you ever see her again? This woman? Dorothy shook her head. No, never. She wasn't local, I'm sure of it. And after the dance, she was gone, just like him. Oh, Jane. Do you think they were involved in something? Spies, perhaps? Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring smile, though her mind was anything but calm. It's too early to say, Dorothy, but you've been a great help. I think I'll take a walk to the village hall later, see if it jogs any more memories. And perhaps the archives, there might be something. There, a record of visitors or events from that summer. Dorothy clapped her hands, her eyes bright with excitement. You're sleuthing again, aren't you? Oh, I knew it. You'll have this sorted out in no time. But be careful, Jane. If there was a traitor in St. Mary Mead, someone might not want you digging up the past. Miss Marple chuckled softly, rising from her chair. I'm only an old woman with a sketchbook. Dorothy. Who could possibly mind? But as she gathered her things and stepped back into the misty morning, her heart beat a little faster. The village, with its quiet lanes and familiar faces, suddenly felt like a puzzle with missing pieces she was determined to find. The village hall stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, a sturdy stone building with a slate roof and windows that rattled in the wind. It hadn't changed much since 1943, though the bunting was long gone, replaced by posters for the upcoming flower show. Miss Marple pushed open the heavy door, the scent of polished wood and old books greeting her. The hall doubled as the village's archive, its back room stuffed with dusty ledgers, photographs, and minutes from parish meetings stretching back decades. Mrs. Wicks, the hall's caretaker, was sweeping the floor, her gray hair pinned in a tight bun. Miss Marple, what brings you here? Not signing up for the flower show committee. I hope you'd outshine us all with those roses of yours. Miss Marple smiled, shaking her head. Not today, Mrs. Wicks. I'm after something a bit older. Records from the war, perhaps, or anything about the summer of '43. I'm trying to track down a visitor who came to the village then. Mrs. Wicks leaned on her broom, her eyes narrowing with interest. The war, eh? That was a time. We had all sorts billeted here, soldiers, evacuees, even a few odd ducks who didn't quite fit. What sort of visitor? A man, Miss Marple said, choosing her words carefully. Charming, well-dressed, likely an officer. He was at the garden party and the dance that summer. I don't suppose you have any guest lists or photographs from those events? Mrs. Wicks tapped her chin, thinking. Guest lists? Probably not. Things were so chaotic then. But photographs, maybe. We've got boxes of them in the archive, mostly unlabeled. People donated them after the war. Bits and bobs from the village events. Come, I'll show you. She led Miss Marple to the back room, where shelves groaned under the weight of cardboard, boxes, and leather-bound books. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows. Mrs. Wicks pulled down a box labeled 1940 to 1945 and set it on a rickety table. Have a look through here. I'll be out front if you need me. Mind the dust, it's a fright. Miss Marple settled at the table, her gloved hands carefully sifting through the photographs. Black and white images spilled out, children playing in the village square, soldiers laughing over pints at the pub, women knitting socks for the war effort. Her fingers paused on a photograph of the village dance, the hall aglow with lanterns, couples twirling across the floor. And there, in the background, was the man from her sketch, his smile unmistakable, his posture relaxed but alert. He stood near the refreshment table, his head bent toward a woman with a red scarf draped over her shoulders. Her breath caught. Dorothy's memory had been spot on. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her posture tense, almost guarded, suggested she was no casual dance partner. Miss Marple turned the photograph over, hoping for a caption, but found only a date, August 12th, 1943. She tucked the photograph into her bag, her mind racing. The woman with the red scarf was a new piece of the puzzle. But who was she, and what had she been doing with the man in the sketch? As she continued searching, she found a slim ledger labeled Village Events, 1943. Flipping through its pages, she scanned lists of attendees for various gatherings, teas, fundraisers, dances. Most names were familiar, villagers she'd known for years, their families still in St. Mary Mead. But one entry caught her eye, scrawled in the margin of the dance's guest list. E. Langley, guest of Capt. Harrow. The name sent a jolt through her. Edward Langley. It matched the cryptic hint in the sketchbook's letter, which had mentioned an E.L. Who knew too much? Miss Marple closed the ledger, her heart pounding. Edward Langley, a charming officer, a fleeting visitor, and now, perhaps, a traitor. But who was Captain Harrow? And why had he brought Langley to St. Mary Mead? And the woman with the red scarf, what role had she played? The photograph and the ledger were clues, but they raised more questions than answers. She needed to know more about Langley, about the dance, about the whispers of betrayal that had haunted the village. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the sketchbook open once more. The photograph lay beside it, the man's face staring up at her, his smile both familiar and unsettling. She turned to the sketchbook's next page, where a faint pencil mark caught her eye, a series of numbers and letters scribbled in the margin, almost invisible. A code, perhaps, or a note she'd written in haste all those years ago. It read, 2315, MRD. The 12th of August 43. The date matched the dance, and MRD could only mean Mill Road, the lane that wound past the old mill, where Dorothy had mentioned. Strange lights during the war. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting needles. The mill, a place of shadows and secrets, even now. She remembered the store's whispers of late-night meetings, signals sent under cover of darkness. Had Langley been there, slipping away from the dance to meet someone? And had the woman with the red scarf been with him? The code, the photograph, the name, they were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a betrayal. One that had cost lives and left scars on St. Mary Mead. She set her knitting aside, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, she would visit Mill Road, see what traces remained of that long-ago night. And she would find out who Edward Langley had been and who had protected him. The village might have forgotten its guest, but Miss Marple had not. And she would not rest until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 4. A name resurfaceth. Morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate shadows on the worn oak table where she sat, her fingers tracing the edges of her old sketchbook. The pages, yellowed and fragile, held secrets she hadn't dared revisit until now. The portrait of the stranger, his sharp jawline, the glint in his eyes stared back at her, as vivid as the day she'd sketched it in 1943. She closed the book gently, her mind already racing with the name that had surfaced the previous evening, Edward Langley. The village of St. Mary Mead was quiet that morning, save for the distant hum of a tractor and the chatter of sparrows in the hedgerows. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, tucked the sketchbook under her arm and set out for the village archives, a small room tucked behind the library in the parish hall. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and early autumn leaves. She walked with purpose, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the cobblestone path. Her thoughts tangled in memories of a wartime summer when trust was a luxury and secrets were currency. The archives were tended by Miss Eliza Pritchard, a weary woman with a penchant for organization and a memory sharper than most. Eliza had been a schoolgirl during the war, and though she'd never been one for gossip, she had a knack for recalling details others overlooked. Miss Marple found her sorting through a stack of dusty ledgers, her glasses perched precariously on her nose. "Good morning, Eliza," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but measured. "I've come to poke about in the old records, if you don't mind." Eliza glanced up, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. Jane Marple, poking about. That's never just idle curiosity. What's caught your interest this time? Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting the sketchbook on the counter. A name from the past, Edward Langley. Do you recall him? He was in St. Mary Mead during the war, around 43. An officer, I believe. Eliza's fingers paused on a ledger, her brow furrowing. Langley. Yes, I remember the name. Handsome fellow, wasn't he? all charm and smiles, but he kept to himself mostly. Came and went like a shadow. Why do you ask? Miss Marple hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I found something that jogged my memory. A sketch I made of him, tucked away in an old book. I'm trying to piece together who he was and what he was doing here. Eliza raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Well, let's see what we can dig up. The wartime records are a bit of a mess, but I'll help you look. Photographs, letters, anything with his name might be in the back. The archives room was a labyrinth of shelves, crammed with boxes of faded documents, ration books, and yellowing photographs. The air smelled of old paper and mildew, and a single bulb cast a dim glow over the chaos. Miss Marple and Eliza set to work, pulling out files labeled 1940 to 1945 and sifting through their contents. There were lists of evacuees, records of blackout violations, and minutes from village council meetings, but nothing immediately pointed to Edward Langley. As they worked, Miss Marple's mind drifted back to that summer. She'd been younger then, her eyes sharp and her hands steady, volunteering in a makeshift office at the village hall where coded messages were deciphered for the war effort. Langley had arrived in July, introduced as an officer on leave, recovering from a minor injury. His easy smile and polished manners had won over the village, but Miss Marple had noticed the way his eyes darted, the way he lingered near the post office or slipped away during gatherings. She'd sketched him one afternoon, sitting on a bench in the village square, his posture too perfect, his gaze too watchful. Here's something, Eliza said, breaking Miss Marple's reverie. She held up a thin folder labeled Village Events, 1943. Inside was a photograph, creased and faded, showing a crowd at the annual summer dance. The men wore uniforms or ill-fitting suits, the women in floral dresses, their faces bright with the rare joy of wartime festivity. In the center stood a man with dark hair and a confident smile, his arm around a young woman whose face was half hidden by a tilt of her head. Miss Marple's breath caught. That's him, she said, softly, pointing to the man. Edward Langley. Eliza squinted at the photograph, then turned it over. On the back, in neat cursive, was written, Summer Dance, St. Mary Mead, July 1943. Capped Edward Langley and Miss Clara Henshaw. Clara Henshaw, Miss Marple murmured, the name unfamiliar yet heavy with significance. Do you know her, Eliza? Eliza shook her head. Not well. She was a quiet sort, worked at the bakery during the war. Left the village not long after, I think. There were rumors she'd run off with someone, but no one knew for sure. Miss Marple studied the photograph again, noting the way Langley's hand rested on Clara's shoulder, possessive yet distant. Clara's face, though partially obscured, held a tension that didn't match the festive mood. Miss Marple tucked the photograph into her pocket, her mind already turning to the next step. There's more in the sketchbook, she said, almost to herself. I found a note, coded, tucked between the pages. I haven't deciphered it yet, but it feels important. Eliza's eyes widened. Coded, Jane. What have you stumbled into? You're not saying this Langley was some sort of spy, are you, Miss? Marple gave a small, enigmatic smile. I'm not saying anything yet, but I'd like to borrow this photograph, if I may, and any other records you find with Langley's or Clara's names. Eliza nodded, though her expression was wary. I'll keep looking. But be careful, Jane. Digging up the past can stir up trouble. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the sunlight, the photograph and sketchbook weighing heavily in her hands. The village was waking up now, with children running through the square and Mrs. Price from the grocer's sweeping her stoop. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind piecing together fragments of memory and suspicion. Langley had vanished after that dance, she recalled, leaving behind whispers of scandal and unanswered questions. The coded note in her sketchbook scrawled in a cipher she'd once known well suggested he'd been more than a charming officer. But who was Clara Henshaw, and how did she fit into his story? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the sketchbook and photograph on her dining table, alongside a notepad and a well-worn pencil. The coded note was tucked into the sketchbook's binding, a slip of paper no larger than a bookmark. Covered in a jumble of letters and numbers, K3V7P9, M2R4, 51N to 3W. She recognized the format immediately, a simple substitution cipher, one she'd used during her decoding days. It was a location, she was sure, but the key to unlocking it lay in her memory of wartime protocols. She brewed a pot of tea, the familiar ritual calming her nerves, and sat down to work. The cipher was straightforward, but required a specific key, likely a word or phrase Langley had used. She tried St. Mary Mead, then wartime, but neither worked. Frustrated, she turned to the photograph again, studying Clara's half-hidden face. Something about her posture, the tilt of her head, suggested fear or perhaps secrecy. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back to the dance. It had been a warm July evening, the village hall decked with bunting and lit by lanterns. Langley had been the center of attention, twirling women across the floor, his laughter, bright but calculated. Miss Marple, then in her late 30s, had watched from the sidelines, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She'd noticed Clara, to a shy girl with a quick smile, always glancing at Langley as if waiting for a signal. When he'd slipped out during a waltz, Clara had followed, and Miss Marple, ever observant, had trailed them to the edge of the hall, where she'd seen Langley pass a folded paper to a man in the shadows. The memory jolted her. The man in the shadows, his face had been obscured, but his voice had been low, urgent. Could he have been the key to the cipher? She tried shadow as the key, shifting the letters accordingly. The code began to unravel. K3V7P9 became 51N. M2R4 became to 3W coordinates. A location near St. Mary Mead, perhaps tied to that secret meeting. Miss Marple fetched an old map of the village from her bookshelf, its edges frayed from years of use. She plotted the coordinates 51 degrees north, 23 degrees west, finding they pointed to a spot just beyond the old mill, a place rarely visited even during the war. The mill had been abandoned then, its will stilled by neglect, but rumors had swirled about strange lights seen there at night. Could Langley have used it as a meeting point? She decided to visit the mill, but not alone. The village was safe, or so it seemed. But Miss Marple was no fool. She telephoned Tommy Beersford, the young historian who'd arrived in St. Mary Mead to research wartime espionage. Tommy was eager, perhaps too eager, but his knowledge of military records could prove useful. He arrived within an hour, his tweed jacket slightly rumpled, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping into her cottage, "you sounded urgent on the phone." "What's this about a coded note?" She showed him the sketchbook, the photograph, and her deciphered coordinates. "Edward Langley was at the dance in 43, and I believe he was involved in something clandestine. This note points to the old mill. I'd like to see what's there, but I'd rather not go alone." Tommy's eyes lit up. "A wartime mystery. Count me in. The mill's been abandoned for decades, but I've read about signals sent from rural spots like that. Could be a transmitter site." They set out together, the late morning sun warming their backs as they followed the winding path to the mill. The countryside was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant bleat of sheep. The mill loomed ahead, its stone walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and empty. Miss Marple's heart quickened not from fear, but from the thrill of unraveling a puzzle. Inside, the mill was a maze of dust and cobwebs, its air heavy with the scent of mold. Tommy carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. They searched the ground floor, finding nothing but broken crates and rusted tools. But in a corner, half hidden by a pile of sacks, Miss Marple spotted a trapdoor, its edges worn but intact. "Help me with this," she said, her voice steady. Despite the dust tickling her throat, Tommy pried open the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. They hesitated, then descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom was a small chamber, its walls lined with cracked stone. In the center stood a rusted metal box, its lid engraved with faint initials, E.L. Edward Langley. Tommy whispered, his voice echoing faintly. Miss Marple knelt beside the box, her fingers tracing the initials. The lock was broken, and inside she found a bundle of papers, yellowed but legible, and a small, battered notebook. The papers were maps marked with cryptic symbols, and the notebook contained lists of dates and times, written in Langley's precise hand. One entry caught her eye: July 15, 1943. Meeting at 2300. CH to confirm. CH. Miss Marple said softly, "Clara Henshaw." Tommy frowned. "You think she was in on it?" "Whatever it was, I don't know yet," Miss Marple admitted. "But she was at the dance, and she followed him. She knew something." They took the papers and notebook back to the cottage, spreading them across the table. The maps showed locations around St. Mary Mead, each marked with a cross, and the notebook hinted at a network of contacts, though names were coded. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the dots. Langley had been no ordinary officer, and Clara Henshaw was no mere bystander. The mill, the coordinates, the secret meeting, it all pointed to espionage, but the scope remained unclear. As evening fell, Miss Marple invited Tommy to stay for tea, and they pored over the documents. One map showed a route from the mill to a nearby airfield, long since abandoned. Another listed a series of radio frequencies, suggesting Langley had been transmitting messages. But to whom? And why had Clara vanished? "Tommy," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, "do you have access to military records? Something that might list Langley's movements or associates?" Tommy nodded. "I can check the archives in London. There's a database of wartime officers, and I've got contacts who can dig deeper. If Langley was a traitor, there'll be a trace somewhere." "Good," she said, her eyes gleaming. "And I'll visit Mrs. Clement again. She mentioned Clara's family. There might be more to learn there." As Tommy left, promising to return with any findings, Miss Marple sat alone, the sketchbook open before her. The coded note, now deciphered, had led her to the mill, but the notebook and maps raised more questions than answers. Langley's charm, Clara's fear. The shadowed man at the dance, it was a puzzle, and she was only beginning to see its shape. She turned to the photograph again, studying Clara's face. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of defiance beneath the fear. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Whatever Clara had been caught up in, it had cost her dearly, and Langley, his smile hid a darkness she was determined to uncover. The chapter closed with Miss Marple lighting a candle, the flame casting shadows across the sketchbook. She picked up her pencil and began to jot down her thoughts, her handwriting as neat and precise as ever. The mill had given her a piece of the puzzle, but the truth lay deeper, in the secrets of a dance long forgotten and a name that refused to stay buried. Chapter 5. The Dance of Deception. The village hall of St. Mary Mead glowed under the soft flicker of wartime lanterns, their amber light casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. It was the summer of 1943, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of lavender perfume, polished shoes, and the faint, inescapable tang of rationed tobacco. The hall was alive with the hum of a village dance, a rare moment of reprieve from the war's relentless grip. Couples twirled to the upbeat strains of a gramophone, its needle scratching out a lively waltz, while laughter and chatter rose above the music like a defiant chorus. Against the distant drone of bombers, Jane Marple, younger than, her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, stood near the refreshment table, a glass of lukewarm lemonade in her hand. Her cotton dress, a simple blue affair with a modest neckline, swayed slightly as she tapped her foot to the rhythm. She was not here to dance, though. She had a lightness to her step that surprised those who underestimated her quiet demeanor. No, Jane was here to observe, her mind as keen as a blade, slicing through the surface of smiles and pleasantries to the undercurrents beneath. The hall was a tapestry of familiar faces. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, flitting about with a tray of scones. Young Tommy Pierce, barely 17, trying to muster the courage to ask Lily Bantry for a spin. And old Mr. Harrow, the village elder, lingering by the door, his eyes darting nervously as if expecting an uninvited guest. But it was the stranger who drew Jane's attention most of all, a man named Edward Langley, the charming officer who had arrived in St. Mary Mead a week ago, billeted at the vicarage under the pretense of a brief leave. Langley was impossible to ignore. Tall, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and eyes that sparkled with a roguish charm, he moved through the crowd like a fox through a henhouse. His uniform, impeccably pressed despite the war's shortages, gleamed with the polish of a man who knew his effect. He danced with every eligible woman in the room, his laughter ringing out as he spun them with effortless grace. Yet, to Jane's discerning eye, there was something off about him, a flicker of calculation in his smile, a glance that lingered too long on the hall's exits, a hand that brushed too casually against a pocket where a folded paper might hide. "Miss Marple, you're not dancing." Mrs. Clement's voice broke through her thoughts, bright and teasing as she approached with her tray. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the room, her apron dusted with flour from an earlier baking frenzy. Jane smiled, her expression soft, but her eyes never leaving Langley, who was now whispering something to Clara Henshaw, a local girl with a reputation for being easily charmed. "Oh, I'm quite content to watch, Dolly. The dance floor tells its own stories, you know." Mrs. Clement chuckled, setting the tray down. "You and your stories. You'd think we were all characters in one of those detective novels you're so fond of. What do you see out there, then? Anything scandalous?" Jane's lips twitched, but she kept her tone light. "Only the usual village intrigues. Though I must say, our new guest seems to have a knack for making friends." Mrs. Clement followed her gaze to Langley, who was now leading Clara through a particularly daring twirl, her laughter echoing as her skirt flared. "Captain Langley, Beau. He's a charmer, isn't he? Half the girls are smitten, and the other half are pretending not to be. He was telling me just yesterday about his time in London, such stories. You'd think he'd seen the king himself." "Has he?" Now, Jane's voice was mild, but her mind was racing. Langley's stories were too polished, too perfectly tailored to each listener. She'd overheard him earlier, regaling Tommy Pierce with tales of dogfights in the sky, then switching seamlessly to romantic Persian escapades when speaking to Lily Bantry. A man who could spin such varied yarns was either a born storyteller or a liar dot as the waltz ended. Langley bowed to Clara, who was breathless and beaming, and excused himself. Slipping toward the back of the hall, Jane's eyes narrowed. He moved with purpose, his hand brushing his jacket pocket again. as if checking something was still there. She set her lemonade down, untouched, and drifted toward the edge of the crowd, her movements as unassuming as a shadow. The hall's back door led to a small garden, where couples often stole away for a moment of privacy. Jane paused near the door, pretending to adjust her shawl, her ears straining for any sound. The gramophone struck up a slower tune, a foxtrot that muffled the chatter inside. But she caught the faint creak of the door as it opened and closed. Langley had stepped outside. She hesitated only a moment before following, her soft-soled shoes silent on the wooden floor. The night air was cool, heavy with the scent of roses and the distant hum of a generator. The garden was dimly lit by a single lantern, its light swaying in a breeze. Langley stood near a low stone wall, his back to her, speaking in a low, urgent voice to a figure cloaked in shadow. The other person was shorter, their face obscured by a scarf, but their posture suggested tension, their hands gesturing sharply. Jane pressed herself against the wall, her heart quickening. She couldn't catch their words, the wind carried them away, but the rhythm of their speech was clipped, almost coded, like the Morse she'd been decoding for the war effort. Langley reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, passing it to the figure, who tucked it away swiftly before turning to leave. As the figure moved, the lantern's light caught a glint of something metallic at their waist, a belt buckle, perhaps, or a badge. Langley lingered a moment longer, lighting a cigarette. The flare of the match illuminating his face, his expression, was no longer charming. It was hard, calculating, the face of a man who knew he was playing a dangerous game. Then he turned and re-entered the hall, leaving Jane alone in the garden. Her mind alight with questions. She slipped back inside, her face composed. But her thoughts were a whirlwind. Who was the shadowed figure? What was on that paper, and why? Did Langley, a man who seemed to have the village eating out of his hand, need to sneak into the dark for a clandestine meeting? The dance continued, oblivious to the secrets unfolding in its margins. Jane resumed her place by the refreshment table, her eyes tracking Langley as he rejoined the crowd, his charm slipping back on like a well-worn mask. But her attention was drawn to another figure, Mr. Harrow, the village elder, who had been watching Langley from the corner of the room. Harrow's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a glass of sherry. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Jane's mind flashed to the sketch she'd drawn of Langley earlier that week, tucked away in her sketchbook at home. She'd captured his face in charcoal, not out of admiration, but because something about him had set her instincts tingling. And now, she was certain that sketch held more than artistic merit. It was a record of a man who was not what he seemed. As the evening wore on, Jane found herself drawn into a dance by Tommy Pierce, who blushed furiously as he stammered an invitation. She accepted with a smile, letting him lead her awkwardly across the floor. But her eyes never strayed far from Langley. Midway through the dance, she caught a glimpse of him slipping away again, this time toward the cloakroom. She excused herself from Tommy, murmuring something about needing air, and followed at a discreet distance. The cloakroom was a small, dimly lit space filled with coats and hats, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs. Langley was alone, kneeling by a coat that Jane recognized as belonging to Clara Henshaw. He reached into its pocket, pulling out a small, folded map, his movements quick and practiced. Jane held her breath, hidden behind a rack of shawls, as he studied the map under the faint glow of a pocket torch. It was no ordinary map she caught. A glimpse of grid lines and coordinates, the kind used by military planners, not civilians. Langley's face was unreadable as he tucked the map into his own pocket, replacing it with another folded paper. He stood, smoothing his uniform, and returned to the dance floor. leaving Jane with a racing pulse and a certainty that she had stumbled onto something far bigger than village gossip. She waited until he was gone before approaching Clara's coat. Her fingers brushed the paper he'd left behind, a note, written in a hurried scrawl. Mill, midnight. Don't be late. The words sent a chill down her spine. The old mill, abandoned since the war began, was a perfect place for secrets, and midnight was hours away, giving her time to think, to plan, to decide whether to act. Back in the hall, the dance was winding down, couples drifting toward the exits, their laughter softer now, tinged with the weariness of wartime. Jane caught sight of Clara, her face flushed with excitement, whispering to Lily Bantry about Langley's charm. Jane's heart sank. Clara was in over her head, entangled with a man who was playing a game she couldn't possibly understand. As the gramophone played its final notes, Jane made her way to Mr. Harrow, who was still lingering by the door, his sherry untouched. "Mr. Harrow," she said softly, her voice warm but probing. "You seem troubled tonight. Is everything all right?" Harrow started, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment before darting away. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's nothing. Just the war, you know, weighs on us all. Indeed it does," she said, her tone gentle but her gaze sharp. "Though some carry heavier burdens than others, don't they? I couldn't help but notice you watching Captain Langley. An interesting man, isn't he?" Harrow's hand tightened around his glass, and for a moment, she thought he might drop it. "He's charming," he said, his voice strained. "Everyone seems to think so." "Everyone, perhaps," Jane said, her smile unwavering. "But not everyone trusts a charming face, Mr. Harrow. Sometimes the most charming people have the most to hide." Harrow's face paled further, and he excused himself. Abruptly, muttering about needing to check on something at home, Jane watched him go, her mind piecing together the fragments of the evening. Langley's whispered meeting, the map, the note, and now Harrow's unease. They were all connected, she was sure of it. But the how and why remained elusive. As the hall emptied, Jane lingered, helping Mrs. Clement tidy up, her hands busy, but her mind elsewhere. The sketchbook at home called to her, its pages a silent witness to her suspicions. She would add to it tonight notes, observations, perhaps another sketch of that shadowed figure. The dance had been a performance, but not the kind the village had expected. It was a dance of deception, and Jane Marple was determined to uncover its final steps. The night air was cool as she stepped outside, the stars bright above St. Mary Mead. The village slept, unaware of the secrets stirring in its heart. Jane pulled her shawl tighter, her steps steady as she walked home, her mind already turning to the mill, to midnight, to the truth that waited in the shadows. Chapter 6. The code in the Margine's morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate shadows on the worn oak table where her sketchbook lay open. The cryptic note she'd found tucked between its pages stared back at her, its ink faded but legible, a string of numbers and letters, scribbled in a hasty hand. To anyone else, it might have seemed a meaningless jumble, but to Jane Marple, it was a whisper from the past, urging her to listen closely. She adjusted her spectacles, her fingers tracing the margins of the sketchbook where the code was written, her mind already turning over the possibilities. This was no idle doodle, it was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it. The code read 51.4032 minus 0.7321 23 o'clock, the 14th of August 43. Coordinates, a place, a time, and a date from the war years. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she recognized the numbers for what they were. A location near St. Mary Mead. The old mill, she thought, her heart quickening. It was a crumbling relic even in 1943, tucked away in a wooded hollow by the river. Its will long stilled. Why would Edward Langley, the charming officer whose face haunted her sketch, have noted such a place? And what had happened there at 11 o'clock on that August night? She closed the sketchbook, her mind alight with questions. The mill was a half-hour's walk from her cottage, and though her knees weren't as spry as they'd been in 43, she felt a surge of resolve. She'd visit the site today, alone, to see what secrets it still held. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and tucking the sketchbook into her basket, she set out, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The village was waking slowly, its cobbled streets bathed in the soft gold of late summer. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, waved from her shop, and young Tommy Baxter cycled past, his newspaper bag swinging. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in memories of wartime St. Mary Mead. Back then, the village had hummed with quiet purpose women knitting socks for soldiers, men patrolling as home guard, and she, Jane Marple, deciphering coded messages in a drafty vicarage room. The war had brought strangers to their doorstep, and not all had been what they seemed. Edward Langley, with his easy smile and officer's uniform, had been one such enigma. The path to the mill wound through a copse of ash trees, their leaves whispering in the breeze. As she approached, the air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. The mill came into view, its stone walls half swallowed by ivy, the river murmuring beside it. The wheel, splintered and moss-covered, stood frozen, a monument to forgotten days. Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the scene. It was quiet now, but in 1943, it would have been a perfect hiding place, secluded, shadowed, far from prying eyes. She stepped closer, her basket bumping against her hip. The coordinates pointed here, she was certain. But what had Langley been doing? She circled the mill, her gaze sharp, searching for anything out of place. The ground was uneven, overgrown with nettles and brambles, but near the base of the mill, she spotted a patch of earth that looked disturbed, less tangled than the rest. Kneeling carefully, she brushed away leaves, revealing a flat stone half buried in the soil. It was too deliberate to be natural. Her fingers, though aged, were steady as she pried the stone loose. Beneath it was a rusted metal box, no larger than a biscuit tin, its edges corroded but intact. Her breath caught. She glanced around. No one was near, only the river's soft gurgle breaking the silence. With a handkerchief, she lifted the box, its weight surprising her. It was locked, but the clasp was frail, and a gentle tug with her hairpin popped it open. Inside was a tangle of wires and dials. A compact device she recognized at once, a radio transmitter, the kind used by spies to send coded messages. Her heart thudded. Langley had been here, signaling someone. But who? And why hide the transmitter? She examined it closely, noting a scrap of paper taped to its underside. It was brittle, the ink smudged, but she could make out a single word: Raven. A code name, perhaps, or a signal identifier. She tucked the paper into her basket, her mind racing. This was no idle discovery. It was proof that Langley's charm had masked a darker purpose. As she stood, a twig snapped behind her. She turned sharply, her hand tightening on her basket. A figure emerged from the trees, a boy, no older than 16, with tousled hair and a wary expression. It was Tommy Baxter, the paper boy, his bicycle propped against a tree. "Miss Marple?" he said, his voice uncertain. "What are you doing out here?" She smiled, her composure unshaken. "Just a morning walk, Tommy. The mill's rather picturesque, don't you think?" He squinted at the box in her hands, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "That looks old." Found it here. Oh, just a bit of rubbish, she said lightly, tucking the transmitter back under the stone. Nothing to bother about. Shouldn't you be finishing your rounds? Tommy hesitated, then nodded, pedaling off with a backward glance. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind alert. He was a good lad, but St. Mary Mead had taught her that even the innocent could carry tales. She'd need to be careful. Back at her cottage, she spread the sketchbook and the scrap of paper on her table. The word Raven staring up at her, the coordinates, the transmitter. The code name they painted a picture of clandestine meetings, of secrets whispered in the dark. Langley had been signaling someone, but who was on the other end? A German contact, a double agent. She needed more than the sketchbook's clues to unravel this. She poured a cup of tea, letting the warmth steady her hands. The coded notes date August 14th, 1943 nagged at her. That was the night of the village dance, when Langley had slipped away, his map catching her eye. Had he gone to the mill afterward? She closed her eyes, summoning the memory. The dance hall, alive with music and laughter. Langley's polished shoes gliding across the floor, his smile disarming. But there had been a moment to glance toward the door, a whispered word to someone in the shadows. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now it felt like a thread she could pull. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the sketchbook. The code was her key, but it wasn't enough. She needed context, records, something to connect Langley's actions to the mill. The vicarage might have answers. Mrs. Clement's husband, the vicar, had kept meticulous logs during the war, and some might still be stored in the parish archives. She'd pay a visit tomorrow, but for now, she'd work with what she had. The coordinates were precise, 51.4032, minus 0.7321. She fetched an old ordnance survey map from her bookshelf, spreading it across the table. Her finger traced the grid, landing on the mill's exact location. Nothing else stood out, no landmarks, no buildings, just the river and woods. The isolation was deliberate, she realized. A perfect spot for a traitor to operate unnoticed. The word Raven gnawed at her. It could be anything: a person, a place, a mission. During the war, codenames were common, but they were rarely random. She sipped her tea, her mind sifting through possibilities. In 1943, St. Mary Mead had been a hub of quiet activity, with volunteers like her decoding messages for the Special Operations Executive. Had Langley's signals been intercepted, she hadn't worked on anything directly tied to him, but she remembered whispers of a compromised operation, a mission that failed because of leaked intelligence. She set her cup down, a new thought striking her. The mill's transmitter wasn't just for sending messages, it could receive them too. Langley wasn't working alone. Someone in St. Mary Mead, or nearby, had been his contact, feeding him information or receiving his signals. The thought sent a chill through her. A traitor in her village, hidden among familiar faces. She'd always prided herself on knowing St. Mary Mead's secrets, but this one had eluded her for decades. The afternoon waned, and Miss Marple decided to test a hunch. She'd decoded enough ciphers in her youth to recognize patterns, and the notes structure numbers and letters in a specific sequence suggested a substitution cipher. Perhaps a variation of the Wegener she'd used during the war. She fetched a pencil and paper, transcribing the code again. 51.4032 minus 0.7321 mm, 23 o'clock, the 14th of August 43. The coordinates were clear, but mm puzzled her. The mill, a person's initials? She tried decoding it as a cipher key, using Raven as the keyword. After an hour of trial and error, she leaned back, frustrated. The code resisted her efforts, its meaning locked away. But the transmitter's discovery was enough to confirm her suspicions. Langley had been up to no good, and the mill was his base. She needed to know what he'd sent, and to whom. The parish archives might hold a clue, perhaps a record of unusual activity that night, or a mention of Raven. As dusk settled, she lit a lamp and returned to the sketchbook. Flipping through its pages, the portrait of Langley stared back, his eyes rendered with uncanny detail. She'd drawn it in 1943, her hand guided by a nagging sense that he wasn't what he seemed. Now she saw it anew, the slight smirk, the tilt of his head, as if he knew he was being watched. Harrow, the village elder, had sketched him too. She'd learned later, a confession of sorts, hidden in plain sight. But why had Harrow kept silent? And why had her own sketchbook become a repository for such dangerous truths? A knock at the door startled her. She closed the sketchbook, slipping it beneath a cushion. It was Mrs. Price, her face flushed from the evening chill, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Evening, Miss Marple," she said, handing it over. "This came for you at the post office. No sender's name, which is odd." Miss Marple thanked her, her fingers brushing the parcel's rough surface. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, typed and unsigned. It read, "The mill holds more than you think. Check the wheel." Her pulse quickened. Someone knew she'd been there. Someone who wanted her to keep digging or to stop. She folded the note, her mind alert. The wheel. She hadn't thought to check it, distracted by the transmitter. Tomorrow, she'd return, but she'd need to be cautious. Secrets this old didn't resurface without reason. Sleep came fitfully that night. Her dreams tangled with images of Langley's face, the mill's shadowed walls, and the word Raven whispered in the dark. By morning, she was resolved. She'd visit the mill again, then the vicarage. The wheel might hold another clue, and the parish archives could confirm her suspicions about Langley's contacts. She dressed carefully, choosing a sturdy coat and her most practical hat. The village was quiet as she set out, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. At the mill, she approached the wheel, its splintered blades looming over the river. The anonymous note had been specific. "Check the wheel." She ran her hands along the wood, feeling for anything unusual. Near the base, where the wheel met the water, she found a hollowed-out section, sealed with a metal plate. It was rusted but loose, and with effort, she pried it open. Inside was a small leather pouch, damp but intact. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a folded map, its edges frayed. It showed St. Mary Mead and the surrounding area, with a red X marking the mill. Beside it was a list of dates and times, including August 14th, 1943, 11 p.m. She tucked the pouch into her basket, her mind racing. The map was Langley's. She was sure-proof of his movements, his meetings. But the anonymous note troubled her. Who had sent it? Tommy Baxter had seen her at the mill, but he was a boy, not likely to craft such a message. Someone else was watching, someone with knowledge of that night. She glanced around, the woods suddenly oppressive. The river's murmur felt like a warning. Back at her cottage, she spread the map on her table, the sketchbook open beside it. The list of dates matched entries in the parish archives she'd seen years ago, nights when the home guard reported odd lights near the mill. Langley had been active, signaling his contacts. But the map suggested a network, a chain of communication stretching beyond St. Mary Mead. The word Raven appeared again, scrawled in the map's margin. It was no coincidence. She needed help now, someone with access to records she couldn't reach. Tommy, the young historian, came to mind. He'd mentioned researching wartime espionage, and his enthusiasm might uncover what her aging memory couldn't. She penned a note, inviting him for tea tomorrow. He'd be curious, perhaps too curious, but she'd guide him carefully, revealing only what was necessary. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the sketchbook in her lap. The code, the transmitter, the map, they were pieces of a puzzle, each one pointing to a betrayal that had cost lives. Langley had been the face, but someone else had pulled the strings. Raven, she thought, her eyes narrowing. Whoever you were, I'll find you. The village slept, but Jane Marple was wide awake, her mind as sharp as ever, chasing a truth buried for decades. Chapter 7. An unlikely alias. Jane Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the faded floral wallpaper of her St. Mary Mead cottage. Her fingers, nimble despite their years, paused over her knitting needles as her sharp eyes lingered on the sketchbook, resting on the polished oak table. The cryptic sketch of Edward Langley, with his sly smile and piercing gaze, seemed to stare back at her, daring her to unravel the secrets it held. The coded note she'd deciphered in the previous day's coordinates pointing to the old millhead only deepened the mystery. Who was Langley signaling, and why had someone in this sleepy village protected him? The morning was crisp, with autumn leaves swirling outside her window, and Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of curiosity. She needed an ally, someone with access to records she couldn't reach. Someone who could navigate the modern world of archives and whispers of wartime espionage. As if on cue, a knock came at her door, light but purposeful. She set her knitting aside, smoothed her tweed skirt, and opened the door to find a young man standing on her doorstep, his scarf slightly askew and his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Miss Marple. I'm Tommy Beresford, not that Tommy Beresford. I'm afraid, he said with a self-deprecating grin, referencing the famous detective duo he shared a name with. I'm a historian, working on a book about wartime espionage in rural England. Mrs. Clement suggested I speak with you. She said you might have stories. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Mrs. Clement, ever the matchmaker of minds, must have sensed her need for a fresh perspective. Do come in, Mr. Beresford, she said, gesturing to the armchair by the fire. I trust you take tea. Oh, absolutely, Tommy replied, stepping inside and rubbing his hands against the chill. He was in his late 20s, with tousled brown hair and a tweed jacket that looked inherited from an older relative. His energy was infectious, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that told Miss Marple he was no mere academic dabbler. As she poured tea from a bone china pot, Miss Marple studied him. Mrs. Clement mentioned you're researching espionage, a curious subject for St. Mary Mead. We're hardly a hotbed of intrigue. Tommy chuckled, accepting a cup. You'd be surprised. Small villages were perfect for covert operations. During the war, quiet, unassuming, easy to miss. I've been digging through declassified files, and St. Mary Mead pops up more than you'd expect. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. Does it, now? And what brings you to my door, specifically? Tommy leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. Mrs. Clement said you've been asking about a man named Edward Langley. I came across his name in my research, a fleeting mention, but enough to raise questions. I thought you might know something I don't. Miss Marple sipped her tea, considering. She wasn't one to trust easily, but Tommy's earnestness and the mention of Langley's name piqued her interest. She decided to test the waters. Suppose I did know something about this man. What exactly have you found? Tommy reached into his satchel and pulled out a battered notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with neat, handwritten notes. Langley was an officer stationed near St. Mary Mead in 1943. Charming, well-liked, but there's a file buried. deep in the National Archives that marks him as a suspected double agent. Nothing concrete, just whispers. He vanished after a village event, and the trail goes cold. But there's a note in the file, almost an afterthought, suggesting he wasn't working alone. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. An accomplice, you say? Exactly. Tommy's eyes lit up. The file mentions coded signals sent from this area, intercepted but never fully traced. I think Langley was part of something bigger, and someone here was helping him. Problem is, the records are incomplete, pages missing, names redacted. I was hoping you might have heard stories from the war, something the archives don't capture. Miss Marple set her cup down, her mind racing. Tommy's information aligned with her own discoveries. The coded note, the coordinates, the transmitter. At the mill. But could she trust him? Historians could be as curious as detectives, and curiosity could lead to loose lips. Yet, his access to records could be invaluable, and his youth might bring a perspective she lacked. She decided to share just enough to keep him engaged. I may have stumbled across something, she said carefully, reaching for the sketchbook. She opened it to the portrait of Langley, its pencil lines still stark after decades. This was drawn in 1943 by someone who knew more than they let on. I've reason to believe it's connected to your signals. Tommy's eyes widened as he leaned closer, studying the sketch. This is incredible. The detail, the eyes. The jawline, it's almost photographic. Who drew this? That, Miss Marple said, is part of the puzzle. But I found a note in this book, a code pointing to a location near the old mill. I suspect it's where your signals originated. Tommy's excitement was palpable. The mill. That's perfect. Rural, isolated, easy to hide equipment. Have you been there? Not yet, Miss Marple admitted. But I intend to. Would you care to join me, Mr. Beresford? 2 heads are often better than one, and your knowledge might prove useful. Tommy grinned. I wouldn't miss it. When do we go? Tomorrow morning, Miss Marple said, her tone firm but kind. But mind you, this is a delicate matter. We must tread lightly. St. Mary Mead has long memories, and not all of them are fond. The next morning, Miss Marple and Tommy set out for the old mill, a crumbling relic on the outskirts of the village. The air was damp, carrying the scent of moss and decaying leaves. Miss Marple, bundled in a sensible coat and scarf, carried a small satchel with a sketchbook and a notebook of her own. Tommy, armed with a flashlight and a camera, walked beside her, his enthusiasm barely contained. The mill stood in a hollow, its weathered stones overgrown with ivy, the wheel long since stilled. The coordinates from the sketchbook pointed to a spot behind the structure, where a tangle of brambles hid a low stone wall. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the scene, her mind reconstructing the past. In 1943, this would have been a perfect hiding place, remote, shielded by trees, with the mill's creaks masking any sound of a transmitter. Over there, she said, pointing to the wall. The note mentioned a marker, a carved stone. Let's have a look. Tommy pushed through the brambles, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He knelt by the wall, brushing away dirt until he uncovered a flat stone with a faint etching across with a circle at its center. Got it, he called. This isn't natural. Someone carved this deliberately. Miss Marple joined him, her fingers tracing the symbol. A signal marker, perhaps, she murmured. Something to guide Langley or his contact to the right spot. Tommy began digging around the stone, his hands moving quickly. After a moment, he unearthed a rusted metal box, its hinges corroded but intact. He glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded encouragingly. With a grunt, he pried it open. revealing a tangle of wires and a cracked bakelite case, what remained of a wartime radio transmitter. Good heavens, Miss Marple breathed. It's still here. After all these years, Tommy examined the device, his fingers careful not to disturb the fragile components. This is a German model, a Feldfrenschreiber, rare for these parts. Whoever was using it wasn't just passing notes, they were sending messages directly to the enemy. Miss Marple's mind churned. Langley, with his charm and officer's uniform, had been no ordinary traitor. But who was his accomplice? The transmitter suggested someone with technical skill, someone who could operate and maintain such a device. Her thoughts drifted to the village elder, Mr. Harrow, whose knack for cryptography she'd uncovered. But Harrow was dead. His secrets buried with him, or so she'd thought. Tommy, she said, her voice steady. Your file mentioned an accomplice. Did it give any details, age, profession, anything at all? Tommy shook his head, setting the box down. Nothing specific. Just a codename, Sparrow. The file suggested Sparrow was local, someone with access to Langley's movements. But the records stopped there. Whoever Sparrow was, they covered their tracks well. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Sparrow. A small, unassuming bird, easily overlooked. It fit the profile of someone in St. Mary Mead, a villager who blended in, trusted by all, yet privy to secrets. She felt a chill, not from the autumn air, but from the realization that the traitor might still be among them, or at least their legacy lingered. Let's take photographs, she said, and cover this backup. We don't want to draw attention, not yet. Tommy nodded, snapping pictures of the transmitter and the carved stone. As he worked, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the mill's shadowed interior. A memory flickered. 1943, a night when she'd seen a light flicker in the mill's upper window, dismissed at the time as a trick of her imagination. Now, she wondered. Tommy, she said, do you know anything about Clara Henshaw? She was a local woman, married briefly to Langley before she vanished. Tommy paused, his camera dangling from its strap. Henshaw, the name sounds familiar. I think I saw it in a parish record, but I'd need to check. Why her? She was close to Langley, Miss Marple said. Too close, perhaps. If Sparrow was local, Clara might have known them or been them. Tommy's eyes lit up. That's a lead. I can dig into the archives this afternoon. Parish records, marriage certificates, anything that mentions Clara or Langley if she was involved. There'll be a trace. Miss Marple smiled, pleased with his initiative. Do that, Mr. Beresford, and I'll visit the vicarage. Mrs. Clement may recall more about Clara than she's let on. Women like Clara don't vanish without leaving whispers. That afternoon, while Tommy buried himself in the village archives, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage's sunny parlor, sipping tea with Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife, plump and cheerful, was a font of village gossip, though her memory often needed coaxing. Clara Henshaw, Mrs. Clement mused, stirring her tea. Such a quiet girl, but pretty, with those dark curls. She married that Officer Langley, wasn't it? In a rush, right in the middle of the war. Tongues wagged, of course. People thought she was too young, and he was, well, too charming. Did you ever suspect anything unusual about them? Miss Marple asked, her tone light but probing. Mrs. Clement frowned, her spoon pausing. Not at first. But there was a night-out. It must have been that dance at the village hall when I saw Clara slip outside with someone. Not Langley, mind you. A man in a dark coat, too far to see his face. I thought it odd, but then, wartime was full of oddities. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Did you ever see her with Mr. Harrow, the elder? Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. Mr. Harrow. Goodness, no. He was such a respectable man, always at the church, helping with the accounts. But she hesitated, leaning closer. There was talk, after Clara left, that she'd been seen near the mill with someone late at night. I never believed it. Clara was no sneak, but now you mention Harrow. I do recall he was fond of evening walks. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together fragments. Clara, Langley, Harrow, the mill. The connections were there, but they were threads, not ropes. She needed more. Back at her cottage that evening, Tommy arrived, his face flushed with excitement. I found something, he said, spreading papers on her table. Clara Henshaw's marriage certificate, dated June 1943. But here's the kicker, there's a witness listed, a Mr. Albert Harrow, your village elder. Miss Marple's breath caught. Harrow witnessed their marriage and more. Tommy said, pulling out a photocopied page. This is from a declassified report, dated a month after Langley vanished. It mentions a woman, no name given, who was questioned about coded signals from St. Mary Mead. She claimed ignorance, but the report notes she left the area soon after. I'm betting that was Clara. Miss Marple's fingers tapped the table, her mind racing. Harrow, Langley, Clara, 3 points of a triangle, with Sparrow at its center. Was Clara the accomplice, coerced by love or fear? Or was Harrow the true mastermind, using his respectability as a shield? The sketchbook, with its coded note and Langley's portrait, seemed to pulse with secrets, urging her onward. Tommy, she said, her voice steady, we need to find Clara's last known address. If she's alive, she may hold the key, and if not, her traces might. Tommy nodded, his enthusiasm undimmed. I'm on it. I'll cross-reference the parish records with post-war census data. If Clara's out there, I'll find her. Miss Marple smiled, her faith in her unlikely ally growing. And I'll look into Harrow's past. A man like that doesn't betray his country without reason. We'll meet tomorrow evening, Mr. Beresford. Bring everything you find. As Tommy left, Miss Marple picked up the sketchbook, her fingers brushing the sketch of Langley. The past was unraveling, thread by thread, and she was determined to follow it to its end, no matter where or to whom it led. Chapter 8. Shadows in the parishioness. Jane Marple sat at her small oak desk, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains of her cottage in St. Mary Mead. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from the garden, mingling with the musty aroma of old paper as she turned the brittle pages of the parish records. Her fingers, delicate but steady despite her age, traced the faded ink of names and dates, each entry a whisper from a village that had seen more secrets than it cared to admit. The sketchbook, its leather cover worn and cracked, lay open beside her, the portrait of Edward Langley staring up with eyes that seemed to mock her persistence. Yesterday's discovery at the village archives, a photograph naming Langley, had set her mind ablaze. The man's face, captured in grainy black and white, was undeniably the same as the one she'd sketched decades ago during the war, but it was the coded note tucked into the sketchbook's margins, hinting at a secret meeting that had led her here to the parish records, where she hoped to uncover the next thread in this tangled web of betrayal. The parish hall was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as Mrs. Price, the volunteer archivist, bustled about in the back room. Miss Marple had arrived early, armed with a thermos of tea and a polite but firm resolve. The records, stored in a series of leather-bound ledgers, chronicled baptisms, marriages, and deaths stretching back centuries. She was searching for something specific, a connection to Langley, a trace of his life in St. Mary Mead that might reveal who had shielded him during those dark wartime days. Her eyes scanned the marriage register for 1943, the year Langley had charmed his way through the village. The entries were meticulous, written in the looping script of the former vicar, Mr. Clement. Names like Eliza Hawthorne and Thomas Reed danced across the page, familiar but irrelevant. Then, her breath caught. There, in the faint ink of July, 1943, was an entry she hadn't expected. Edward Langley, bachelor, to Clara Henshaw, spinster. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Clara Henshaw. The name stirred a faint memory. A quiet girl, plain but kind, who worked as a typist at the village post office during the war. She'd been unremarkable, fading into the background of St. Mary Mead's bustling wartime life. Yet here she was, married to a man suspected of treason. The implications sent a shiver through Miss Marple, not of fear, but of the thrill of a puzzle taking shape. She closed the ledger and tucked it under her arm, her mind already racing. Clara had disappeared shortly after the war, or so the village gossip went. Some said she'd moved to London, others that she'd gone abroad. No one had thought much of it at the time. People vanished during those chaotic years, swept away by loss or opportunity. But now, with Langley's name tied to hers, Miss Marple wondered if Clara's departure had been less voluntary than assumed. Mrs. Price, she called softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority that made people listen without realizing they were doing so. The archivist, a stout woman with a penchant for floral dresses, appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on a cloth. Yes, Miss Marple found something interesting. Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed with curiosity. She was no stranger to the village's love of secrets, though she preferred them in the form of harmless gossip. I was wondering, Miss Marple said, adjusting her spectacles, if you recall Clara Henshaw. She worked at the post office during the war, I believe. Married a man named Langley. Mrs. Price's brow furrowed, and she tapped her chin. Clara, yes, quiet thing, always kept to herself. I remember her wedding small affair. Just a few witnesses. That Langley fellow was a looker, mind you, caused quite a stir with the younger girls. But they left soon after, didn't they? Never heard much of her again. Did she have family here? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. Not that I recall. Her parents passed before the war, and she had no siblings. Lived in that little cottage up on Hill Lane, the one that's been empty for years. Why the interest? If I may ask, Miss Marple smiled, deflecting with practiced ease. Just tying up loose ends from an old memory. Thank you, Mrs. Price. You've been most helpful. She left the parish hall, the ledger still under her arm, and stepped into the crisp autumn air. Hill Lane was a short walk past the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread wafted, and the greengrocer where Mr. Pye was arranging apples. With military precision, the village was awake now, its rhythm familiar yet tinged with the weight of her discovery. Clara Henshaw, married to a traitor. Had she known what Langley was? Had she been complicit, or merely a pawn in his game? The cottage on Hill Lane was a forlorn sight, its thatched roof sagging and its windows boarded up. Ivy had claimed the walls, curling over the stone like fingers clutching a secret. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her hand resting on the rusted latch. She hadn't been here in years, but she remembered Clara's quiet pride in her small garden, where roses once bloomed. Now, the garden was a tangle of weeds, and the cottage seemed to sag under the weight of its own abandonment. She pushed open the gate, wincing at its squeak, and approached the door. The lock was rusted, but a gentle push revealed it was unlatched. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint light filtering through the boarded windows cast eerie shadows. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her sensible shoes tapping against the wooden floor. The cottage was small, a parlor, a kitchen, and a single bedroom upstairs. Furniture remained, covered in sheets that had yellowed with time. A photograph on the mantel caught her eye, Clara, young and unsmiling, standing beside a man whose face was unmistakable. Langley. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She moved closer, her fingers brushing the frame. The photograph was formal, likely taken on their wedding day. Clara's eyes held a flicker of something fear, perhaps, or resignation. Langley, by contrast, looked confident, his smile almost smug. She turned the frame over, hoping for a date or inscription, but found nothing. Disappointed, she set it down and continued her search. In the kitchen, she found a drawer filled with old letters, their envelopes brittle and stained. Most were mundane bills, notes from neighbors, but one caught her attention. It was addressed to Clara, postmarked September 1943, just months after the wedding. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and precise. She opened it carefully, mindful of the fragile paper. My dearest Clara, I know you're frightened, but you must trust me. The work we do is vital, and Edward assures me it's for the greater good. Stay quiet, keep your head down, and don't speak of the mill. I'll come for you soon. Destroy this when you've read it. Yours, H. Miss Marple's pulse raced. The mill. The coded note in her sketchbook had pointed to the old mill, where she'd found the remnants of a radio transmitter. And now, this letter, with its cryptic reference to H. Could it be Harrow, the village elder whose name had surfaced in her earlier musings? The man known for his late-night walks and knack for cryptography. She tucked the letter into her handbag, her mind worrying. The cottage held more secrets, she was certain. She moved to the bedroom, where a small wardrobe stood against the wall. Inside, she found a few dresses, their colors faded, and a box of trinkets, hairpins, a locket, a brooch. Nothing remarkable, until she noticed the floorboard beneath the wardrobe. It was slightly raised, as if it had been pried up and replaced carelessly. Kneeling, she pried at the board with a hairpin, her fingers surprisingly nimble. It came loose with a soft creak, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a single photograph, creased and worn. It showed Langley, his arm around a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow. But the posture, the tilt of the head, Miss Marple's breath caught. It was Mr. Harrow, the village elder, standing beside Langley in what looked like a clandestine meeting. Her heart pounded as she slipped the photograph into her handbag alongside the letter. Harrow, the quiet man who taught Sunday school and tended his roses, had been entangled with a traitor. The implications were staggering. Had he been the one receiving Langley's signals at the mill? Had Clara known, or been caught in the middle? As she stood, a noise from downstairs made her freeze. A soft thud, like a door closing. She held her breath, listening. The cottage was supposed to be empty, and she told no one of her visit. Moving silently, she crept to the staircase, peering down into the parlor. A shadow moved across the wall, and then a voice, low, hesitant, called out, "Miss Marple, are you here?" Relief washed over her. It was Tommy, the young historian who'd been helping her piece together the wartime espionage records. She descended the stairs, her composure regained. "Tommy, you gave me quite a start. How did you know I was here?" He stood in the parlor, his coat dusted with leaves from the overgrown path. "Mrs. Price mentioned you were asking about Clara Henshaw. I figured you'd come here. I've got something you need to see." He held up a folder, its edges worn, but its contents neatly typed. "I found this in the county archives this morning. It's about Langley." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Come, let's sit. And you'd best put the kettle on. I've a feeling we'll need tea for this." They settled at the dusty kitchen table, the folder between them. Tommy opened it, revealing a series of typed reports marked confidential. These are MI5 records, declassified last year. They mention Langley by name, a suspected double agent working for the Germans. But here's the kicker. He slid a page toward her. They suspected he had a local contact, someone feeding him information from within the village. No name. But they mention a woman, Clara. Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. She handed Tommy the letter she'd found. Read this. It's from someone signing as H. I believe it's Mr. Harrow, the village elder. Tommy's eyes widened as he read. This ties Harrow to the mill. And if Clara was involved, he trailed off, flipping through the folder. There's more. A report about a radio signal intercepted near St. Mary Mead in August 1943. They couldn't pinpoint the source, but it matches the timeline of Langley's stay here. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning like pieces of a quilt. Clara married Langley, perhaps unaware of his true nature. But this letter suggests she knew something enough to be frightened. And Harrow, she tapped the photograph from the compartment. This places him with Langley, likely at the mill. He was no innocent bystander. Tommy leaned forward, his voice low. Do you think Clara was part of it? Or was she just caught in the crossfire? I don't know yet, Miss Marple admitted. But I intend to find out. Clara's last known address was this cottage, but she vanished after the war. If we can trace where she went, we might uncover what she knew and who else was involved. They spent the next hour combing the cottage, finding little else of note. A few more letters, none as revealing as the first, and a diary with entries, too mundane to be helpful. But the photograph and the letter burned in Miss Marple's mind, each a piece of a puzzle that pointed to betrayal at the heart of St. Mary Mead. As they left the cottage, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across Hill Lane. Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the overgrown garden. Tommy, she said softly, do you know if Clara had any friends in the village? Someone she might have confided in? He thought for a moment. There's old Mrs. Bantry. She was close to Clara's age during the war. If anyone knew her secrets, it'd be her. Miss Marple nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we'll pay Mrs. Bantry a visit tomorrow. But for now, let's keep this between us. The village has long ears, and I'd rather not stir up old ghosts until we're certain. They parted ways, Tommy heading back to his lodgings and Miss Marple to her cottage. As she walked, the weight of the photograph and letter in her handbag felt heavier than their physical presence. Clara Henshaw, Edward Langley, Mr. Harrow, 3 names woven into a web of deceit that had lain dormant for decades. But now, with her sketchbook as the key, Miss Marple was unraveling it, thread by thread. That night, she sat by her fire, the sketchbook open to Langley's portrait. Her fingers traced the lines she'd drawn all those years ago, when she was younger, sharper, but no less observant. The village had always been her strength, its quiet rhythms revealing truths others overlooked. And now, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, she knew she was close to uncovering a truth that would shake St. Mary Mead to its core. Clara's last known address was this cottage, but her story didn't end here. Somewhere, in the shadows of the parish, lay the final piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, would find it. Chapter 9. The house on the hill. Late afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the winding lanes that snaked through the village. Miss Marple, her steps measured but resolute, walked beside Tommy, the young historian, whose enthusiasm for wartime secrets had proven invaluable. The air was thick with the scent of blooming hawthorn and the faint dampness of approaching autumn. But Miss Marple's mind was far from the tranquil beauty of the countryside. Her thoughts churned over the latest discovery: a marriage certificate linking Edward Langley, the charming wartime traitor, to Clara Henshaw, a local woman who had vanished into the shadows of history. The revelation had sent a jolt through her, not unlike the thrill of unraveling a particularly tangled skein of wool. Clara's last known address, an abandoned cottage on the hill overlooking the village, beckoned. Like a cipher waiting to be cracked. Tommy adjusted his satchel, stuffed with notes and photocopies from the village archives. Miss Marple, he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Do you think Clara knew what Langley was up to? I mean, married to a spy, she must have seen something. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, flickered toward him. People see what they wish to see, Tommy. Love has a way of clouding the obvious. But Clara's disappearance so soon after the war, that's no coincidence. We'll know more when we see the cottage. The path to the hill was steep, overgrown, with brambles that tugged at Miss Marple's tweed skirt. She navigated the terrain with surprising agility for a woman of her years, her walking stick tapping the ground like a metronome. Tommy, taller and broader, offered his arm, but she waved it away with a polite smile. I've climbed worse in my time, she said, though her breath came a touch quicker as they ascended. The cottage came into view as they crested the hill, a squat stone structure half swallowed by ivy and thyme. Its windows were boarded, the chimney choked with moss, and the garden, once likely a riot of roses, judging by the gnarled bushes, was now a wilderness of nettles. The place exuded a quiet melancholy, as if it, too, bore the weight of secrets long buried. Tommy pushed open the rusted gate, which squealed in protest. Doesn't look like anyone's been here in decades, he said, eyeing the sagging roof. You sure this is worth the trek? Places like this, Miss Marple replied, her tone soft but firm, have a way of holding onto their stories. Let's see what this one has to say. The front door was warped, its paint peeling like old skin. Tommy gave it a tentative push, but it didn't budge. Miss Marple pointed to a side window, its boards loose and splintered. There, she said. Careful, now. We're not here to break anything. With a bit of effort, Tommy pried the boards free, revealing a grimy pane of glass. He slid the window up, and a musty smell wafted out, a mix of damp wood and forgotten years. Ladies first? He asked, half-dashed joking. Miss Marple chuckled. I'll leave the climbing to you, young man. I'll take the door once you've opened it from inside. Tommy clambered through, his boots thudding on the floorboards within. A moment later, the front door creaked open, and Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The cottage was small, its single room dominated by a stone hearth blackened by long extinguished fires. A rickety table stood in one corner, its surface littered with dust and the husks of dead insects. Above, a loft sagged under the weight of time, accessible by a ladder that looked one step from collapse. It's like stepping into a ghost story, Tommy murmured, brushing cobwebs from his sleeve. Ghosts don't concern me, Miss Marple said, her voice crisp. It's the living who leave the most dangerous traces. She moved to the table, her fingers tracing the edge as if it might whisper its history. Clara lived here, perhaps with Langley for a time. If she knew his secrets, she might have left something behind, something she couldn't take when she fled. Tommy nodded, his historian's instincts kicking in. Letters, maybe, or a diary. Spies' wives always seem to keep diaries in the stories. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Life isn't quite so tidy as stories, but let's hope Clara was a sentimental sort. They began their search, methodical but cautious. Tommy took the loft, testing each rung of the ladder with care. while Miss Marple examined the ground floor. She knelt by the hearth, her knees protesting, and peered into the ashes. Nothing but soot and the faint outline of a burned log. The shelves, bare save for a chipped teacup, offered no clues. But as she moved to the far wall, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. It shifted with a faint groan, revealing a sliver of darkness beneath. "Tommy," she called, her voice steady but urgent. "Bring your torch." He scrambled down, nearly tripping in his haste, and shone his flashlight into the gap. The beam caught the edge of something metallic, a small tin box, rusted but intact, nestled in the space beneath the floor. Tommy pried the board free, his fingers trembling with anticipation, and lifted the box out. It was no larger than a biscuit tin, its lid etched with faint scratches that might once have been initials. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained composed. "Open it," she said. Tommy flicked the latch, which gave way with a reluctant squeak. Inside lay a bundle of letters, yellowed and brittle, tied with a faded ribbon. Beside them was a photograph, its edges curled, showing two figures standing close together. One was unmistakably Edward Langley, his smile as charming as Miss Marple remembered from that wartime dance. The other figure was blurred, their face half hidden by shadow. But something about the posture, a certain tilt of the head, struck a chord in her memory. "Clara's letters," Tommy said, his voice hushed. "This could be it, Miss Marple. The proof we need." She untied the ribbon, her fingers deft despite their age, and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was neat, feminine, but the ink had faded in places, making the words a puzzle in themselves. She read aloud, her voice carrying the weight of discovery. "My dearest Edward, I know you must go tonight, but my heart begs you to stay. They watch us, don't they? I saw the man again, near the mill, his eyes like a hawk's. You say it's nothing, but I can't shake the fear. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you're not one of them." Miss Marple paused, her brow furrowing. "Clara was afraid," she said, "not just of Langley's enemies, but of Langley himself. She suspected something." Tommy leaned closer, his torch casting flickering shadows on the wall. "Keep going. What else does she say?" The next letter was dated a week later, the tone more frantic. "Edward, I found the papers in your coat. Maps, codes, names I don't recognize. You said it was for the war effort, but why hide them from me? I followed you last night to the mill. I saw the light, the signal. Who are you signaling, Edward? What have you done?" Miss Marple's voice grew quieter as she read, the words sinking into the stillness of the cottage. Clara had known more than she should, enough to endanger herself. The final letter, dated just before her disappearance, was the shortest. "I can't stay. They know I know. The man from the mill, he came to the cottage last night. He didn't speak, but I saw his face. If you love me, Edward, tell me the truth. If not, I'm gone." Tommy let out a low whistle. She was running from someone. Langley, maybe, or this other man. But who was he? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the photograph, the shadowed figure nagging at her memory like a half-forgotten tune. She turned it over, hoping for a name, but found only a date. July 1943, the month of the village dance, the night she'd seen Langley slip away with his map. She closed her eyes, letting the past flood back. She was younger then, her hair still brown, her hands unmarred by age. The dance hall had been alive with music, the air thick with the scent of lavender and cigarette smoke. Langley had been the center of attention, his laugh infectious, his eyes always scanning the room. But there had been another man, quieter, older, watching from the edges. She'd seen him speak to Langley, their heads bent together, and later, She'd glimpsed him near the mill, a silhouette against the moonlight. "Mr. Harrow," she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. "The village elder. It was him in the photograph. I'm certain of it." Tommy's jaw dropped. "Harrow, the cryptographer? You think he was the one Clara saw at the mill?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Harrow was respected, trusted. No one would suspect him of anything untoward. But Clara saw something enough to make her fear for her life. And this photograph, it places him with Langley, closer than a village elder should be with a suspected spy. Tommy set the tin box down, his hands restless. So Harrow was in on it. But why? What did he gain from helping Langley? That, Miss Marple said, is what we must find out. But first, let's take these letters and the photograph back. To my cottage. This place is too exposed, and I don't like the idea of prying eyes. They gathered their findings, securing the tin box in Tommy's satchel, and left the cottage as dusk settled over the hill. The village below glowed softly, its lights winking like stars. But Miss Marple felt no warmth from the sight. The past was unraveling, and with it came a chill she couldn't shake. Back at her cottage, with a fire crackling in the hearth, Miss Marple spread the letters on her dining table. Tommy sat across from her, his notebook open, scribbling furiously as she read each one aloud again. The words painted a picture of a woman caught in a web of deceit, her love for Langley warring with her growing suspicion. But it was the photograph that held Miss Marple's attention. Harrow's presence in it was no accident. He had been at the mill, perhaps sending signals alongside Langley, or worse, covering for him. "Tommy," she said, her voice low, "we need to know more about Harrow. His life, his habits, his weaknesses. If he was Langley's accomplice, there must be records something in the village or beyond that tells us why." Tommy nodded, flipping through his notes. "I can check the county archives tomorrow." Harrow was a big name back then, even if he kept to himself. There might be letters, ledgers, anything that shows what he was up to. Miss Marple tapped her finger against the photograph. "And I'll speak to Mrs. Price, the postmistress. She's been in St. Mary Mead longer than most and has a memory like a steel trap. If Harrow was meeting anyone, sending anything, she'd know." As Tommy gathered his things to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Miss Marple, do you think Clara's still out there, alive?" I mean, she looked at him, her eyes softening. "I hope so, Tommy. But people who run from secrets like these, they don't often stay found." Alone again, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the photograph in her hands. Harrow's shadowed face stared back, a ghost from a war that had never truly ended for St. Mary Mead. She thought of Clara, a young woman who had loved too fiercely, seen too much, and she thought of Langley, whose charm had hidden a traitor's heart. The sketchbook, still open on her table, held the portrait of Langley, its lines as sharp as the day she'd drawn it. But now, it was Harrow's face that haunted her, a man she'd passed in the village lanes, never suspecting the secrets he carried. Sleep did not come easily that night. Her dreams were filled with the mill's creaking wheel, the flicker of a radio signal in the dark, and Clara's voice whispering, "They know I know." The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her resolve as firm as the oak table where she took her tea. Mrs. Price's cottage was a short walk, its garden a riot of dahlias that belied the postmistress' stern demeanor. When Miss Marple knocked, the door opened almost at once, revealing Mrs. Price in a starched apron, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. "Jane Marple," Mrs. Price said, her tone a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What brings you here at this hour? Not another of your mysteries, I hope." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "Just a bit of history. Mrs. Price, may I come in? Over tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the war years, letting Mrs. Price ramble about ration books and air raids before mentioning Harrow. The postmistress's eyes narrowed. Old Mr. Harrow, quiet sort, always scribbling in that notebook of his. Used to send letters to London, official ones. But sometimes she paused, stirring her tea. Sometimes he'd post things late at night, parcels with no return address. I thought it odd, but he said it was for the war effort. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did you ever see who he sent them to? Or where? Mrs. Price frowned, her memory straining. Once, I saw a name, some foreign-sounding fellow. Muller, maybe. I didn't think much of it then. Everyone was secretive during the war. Muller. Miss Marple repeated, her mind cataloging the name. It was a common enough surname, but in the context of Langley's espionage, it felt like a piece of the puzzle sliding into place. And Clara Henshaw, did she ever come to the post office with Harrow or Langley? Mrs. Price's face softened. Poor Clara. She was a sweet girl, too good for that Langley fellow. I saw her once, posting a letter in a hurry, looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to grab her. Never saw her again after that. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind buzzing. Muller, a name, a connection. Perhaps the dangerous friend Clara had feared. By the time she returned home, Tommy was waiting, his face flushed with excitement. You won't believe this, he said, spreading papers across her table. I found Harrow's ledger in the county archives. He was in big debt to a man named Hans Muller, a German expatriate living in London. Harrow was sending him payments, but they stopped abruptly in 1943, right around the time Clara disappeared. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Muller, Mrs. Price mentioned him too. He was no expatriate, Tommy. He was Langley's contact, the one receiving the signals from the mill. And Harrow was caught in the middle, paying off his debts. With secrets, Tommy sat back, stunned. So Harrow wasn't just helping Langley, he was trapped. Trapped, Miss Marple agreed, but not innocent. He chose to betray his country, and Clara paid the price for what she knew. The question is, where did she go? And why did Harrow keep that photograph the day wore on? And Miss Marple and Tommy pored over the letters again, searching for any hint of Clara's fate. One phrase, buried in the final letter, caught Miss Marple's eye. The man from the mill, he came to the cottage last night. He didn't speak, but I saw his face. She read it aloud, her voice steady but heavy with realization. Clara saw Harrow, she said, not just at the mill, but here, at her cottage. He came to silence her, or to warn her. Either way, she ran because of him. Tommy rubbed his chin. But the photograph, why keep it? It's incriminating. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the photograph, her mind piecing together the final threads. Harrow kept it because it was his insurance. If Langley ever turned on him, he had proof of their connection. But he hid it here, in Clara's cottage, because he knew no one would look for it. Not after she was gone. The chapter drew to a close as Miss Marple sat back, the fire casting shadows across the room. The photograph lay on the table, Harrow's face a silent accusation. She knew now that he was no mere bystander in Langley's betrayal. He was a key player, driven by desperation and debt. But Clara's fate remained a shadow, and the name Muller loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Miss Marple's quest was far from over, and as she sipped her tea, her eyes drifted to the sketchbook, its secrets still whispering, waiting to be fully unraveled. Chapter 10. The elders' Socrath morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil. softening the edges of the village's stone cottages and muffling the distant bleat of sheep. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped teacup, her mind far from the marmalade and toast before her. The sketchbook, its leather cover worn to a soft sheen, lay open on the table, its pages whispering secrets she had only begun to unravel. The cryptic notes, the faded sketch of Edward Langley, and now the growing suspicion about Mr. Harrow, the village elder, weighed heavily on her. Harrow, with his quiet demeanor and sharp eyes, had always seemed an unassuming figure, a man of cryptic crosswords and late-night walks. But the clues were mounting, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that Harrow's role in this wartime mystery was no mere footnote. She sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her as she considered her next move. The parish records had revealed a connection between Langley and Clara Henshaw, but it was the photograph from Clara's abandoned cottage that had shifted her focus to Harrow. The image, tucked in a hidden compartment, showed Langley standing beside a man whose silhouette matched Harrow's distinctive stoop. The realization had struck her like a sudden gust. Through an open window, Mr. Harrow, the respected elder, might have been more than a bystander in Langley's betrayal. His journal, mentioned in passing by old Mrs. Price at the village shop, was her next target. If it existed, it could confirm her suspicions or unravel them entirely. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her cardigan, and tucked the sketchbook under her arm. The village hall, where parish records and forgotten relics gathered dust, was her destination. As she stepped into the crisp morning air, the cobbled path crunched under her sensible shoes. St. Mary Mead was waking slowly, its rhythm unchanged since the war years she was revisiting in her mind. A milk cart rattled by, and Mrs. Baker waved from her garden, her pruning shears glinting in the pale sun. Miss Marple returned the gesture, her smile polite, but her thoughts elsewhere. She was piecing together a puzzle from decades past, and every step toward the village hall felt like a step deeper into 1943. The hall was a squat building, its stone walls stained by time and weather. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wax polish. Miss Marple nodded to Mr. Grayson, the caretaker, who was polishing the brass plaque on the war memorial. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice echoing faintly in the empty hall. "Looking for something in the archives again?" "Yes, Mr. Grayson," she replied, her tone light but purposeful. "Just a bit of village history. Old records, perhaps a journal or two." He chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're always digging up the past, aren't you? Well, the archives are in the back room. Mind the dust, it's been ages since anyone sorted through that lot." She thanked him and made her way to the archive room, a cramped space lined with sagging shelves. The air was thick with the musty scent of forgotten documents. She began her search methodically, her fingers trailing over faded ledgers and brittle envelopes. The parish records she'd checked earlier had yielded Clara's marriage certificate. But Harrow's journal was a different matter. Mrs. Price had mentioned it in passing, recalling how Harrow, a meticulous man, kept a diary of sorts filled with cryptic notes and ciphers. He was always scribbling, she'd said, her voice tinged with the disdain of one who preferred gossip to books, kept it locked away, like it was gold. After an hour of searching, Miss Marple's patience was rewarded. Tucked behind a stack of parish newsletters was a slim, leather-bound volume, its cover embossed with the initials A.H., Albert Harrow. Her heart quickened as she opened it, the pages crackling under her touch. The entries were written in a precise hand, interspersed with diagrams and codes that reminded her of the wartime messages she'd once decoded. She settled into a creaky chair, her eyes scanning the text for clues. The journal began innocently. Enough notes on church services, village council meetings, the price of coal. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. Harrow's entries grew terse, his words laced with a quiet anxiety. One passage, dated August 1943, caught her eye. The mill at dusk again. He insists on meeting there, though I've warned him it's reckless. The signals must be sent, he says, or all is lost. I cannot refuse not now. The weight of it grows heavier each day. Miss Marple's breath caught. The mill, the same place where she'd found the remnants of a radio transmitter. And he could only be Edward Langley, she read on, her mind racing as Harrow's words painted a picture of a man trapped in a web he hadn't spun. Another entry, a week later, was even more telling. The money came today, slipped into my hand like a bribe for silence. I told him I wanted no part of it, but he laughed. You're in too deep, Albert, he said. I fear he's right. If they find out my name, my family will be ruined. She closed the journal, her thoughts swirling. Harrow hadn't been a willing traitor, but a man coerced, perhaps blackmailed. The money hinted at financial desperation, a motive she'd already suspected. But who was pulling Langley's strings, and why had Harrow kept this journal, risking exposure? She tucked the volume into her bag, her resolve hardening. She needed to know more about Harrow's life, his habits, his secrets, and those late-night walks the villagers had mentioned. As she left the hall, the sun had burned off the mist, and St. Mary Mead sparkled with autumn light. She decided to visit Mrs. Price again, hoping the shopkeeper's endless chatter might yield more details. The village shop was a hub of gossip, its shelves stocked with tinned goods and secrets in equal measure. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a sharp tongue, was behind the counter, sorting through a delivery of apples. Miss Marple, she called, her eyes brightening. Twice in a week. You're up to something, I reckon. Miss Marple smiled, setting her basket on the counter. Just curious about old times, Mrs. Price. You mentioned Mr. Harrow's journal once. Did he ever talk about his walks by the mill? I seem to recall you saying he was often out late. Mrs. Price's eyebrows shot up, delighted to be consulted. Oh, he was a queer one, Mr. Harrow. Always wandering about at odd hours. Said he liked the quiet, but I always thought he was up to no good. My Tom saw him once, near the mill, fiddling with something in the bushes. Looked like a box, Tom said, but he couldn't be sure. A box. Miss Marple's voice was casual, but her mind was alert. How curious. Did Tom ever mention anyone with him? Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Not that he saw, but there were rumors. That Langley fellow, the officer who came through in 43, some said he and Harrow were thick as thieves. My Tom reckoned Harrow was scared of him, though, kept his head down after Langley left. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. And Harrow's family. Did they ever speak of him after he passed? Not much, Mrs. Price said, polishing an apple absently. His wife moved away after the war, and their son young. William died in 44, poor lad. Killed in action, they said. Broke Harrow's heart, I reckon. He was never the same after. The mention of William sent a pang through Miss Marple. She remembered the boy, a quiet lad with his father's sharp eyes, who'd enlisted with dreams of heroism. Could his death have been the final straw that pushed Harrow into desperation? She thanked Mrs. Price and left the shop, her mind turning over the new pieces of the puzzle. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the journal's pages across her dining table, the sketchbook open beside it. The coded note she deciphered pointed to the mill, and now Harrow's entries confirmed it as a meeting place. But the journal hinted at something deeper, a network, perhaps. or a single figure orchestrating Langley's signals. She needed another perspective, someone who'd known Harrow beyond the village's gossip. Tommy, the young historian, was her best bet. His research into wartime espionage had already uncovered Langley's file, and his enthusiasm might unearth more about Harrow. She telephoned the vicarage, where Tommy was staying, and invited him for tea. He arrived promptly, his satchel bulging with notes and his eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple, you've found something, haven't you?" he said, settling into her parlor with a grin. "Perhaps," she replied, pouring tea. "I've been reading Mr. Harrow's journal. It suggests he was involved with Edward Langley's activities, though not willingly. He mentions money, meetings at the mill, and a fear of ruin. Tell me, Tommy, have you come across anything in your research about Harrow? Anything that might explain his role?" Tommy's face lit up, and he rummaged through his satchel, pulling out a battered notebook. "I did some digging after we found Langley's file. Harrow's name popped up in a declassified report about wartime signals in the southeast. Nothing concrete, but there was a note about a civilian cryptographer in St. Mary Mead who'd been questioned in '43. No charges were filed, but the report mentioned financial irregularities." "Financial irregularities," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles clicking softly. "That fits with the journal. Harrow wrote of money changing hands, and Mrs. Price mentioned his son's death. I wonder if he was in debt, perhaps pressured into helping Langley." Tommy nodded, flipping through his notes. "It's possible." The report also mentioned a signal intercepted near St. Mary Mead in August '43, a coded message. That didn't match any known allied patterns. They suspected a double agent, but the trail went cold. If Harrow was involved, he might have been covering for someone higher up. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Or someone closer to home. The photograph from Clara's cottage showed Harrow with Langley, but there was another figure in the background. I couldn't make them out, but it suggests a third party. Harrow's journal mentions dangerous friends. We need to know who they were. Tommy leaned forward, his tea forgotten. I can check the archives at the county library. They've got more wartime record signals logs, maybe even personnel files. If Harrow was working with someone, there might be a trace. Good, Miss Marple said, her voice firm. But be discreet, Tommy. The village has long memories, and some secrets are still guarded. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple took a walk to the old mill. The path was overgrown, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and wild mint. The mill's silhouette loomed against the twilight, its broken wheel creaking faintly in the breeze. She stood where she'd found the radio transmitter's remnants, her mind conjuring the night Langley and Harrow had met here. The journals. Words echoed. The signals must be sent, or all is lost. What had been at stake? And who had Harrow been protecting or fearing? She knelt, her fingers brushing the grass, and noticed a glint in the soil. Digging gently, she unearthed a small, rusted metal tag, etched with a faint serial number. It was the kind used on military equipment, perhaps part of the transmitter. She pocketed it, her thoughts racing. The mill was more than a meeting place, it was the heart of the betrayal. Back home, she examined the tag under a magnifying glass, its numbers barely legible. She jotted them down, intending to pass them to Tommy for his library search. But as she sat by her fire, the journal opened before her. A new entry caught her eye. Dated the night of the village dance. He showed me the map tonight, hidden in his coat. A drop point, he said, for the final signal. I begged him to stop, but he only smiled. You'll see it through, Albert, he said, for William's sake. I cannot bear this any longer. Miss Marple's heart sank. William, Harrow's son, had been leveraged against him, a cruel twist that explained his compliance. She closed the journal, her resolve hardening. Harrow had been no traitor by choice, but a father trapped by circumstance. The final clue lay in that map hand, the mysterious figure who'd orchestrated it all. The chapter of Harrow's life was closing, but the story of the traitor's network was far from over. As she whereupon by the fire, her needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts, Miss Marple felt the weight of the past settling around her. The elder's secret was no longer just a sketch or a journal, it was a confession, etched in ink and regret, waiting for her to bring it to light.